The march of 3 kingdoms on Tor lands devastated its citizens. However, none were more surprised by this change of events than King Tor himself. He felt incredibly uncomfortable. After their civil war, they lost the support of the Cedar clan. Even before that, they lost the warriors of the Agnes clan as well. With both of their top 2 clans gone just like that, Tor Kingdom had less than half of its previous strength. Yet now they were facing enemies from all sides. By this point, the Heavenly Body sect couldn't remain idle any longer. They had to do something. Under the pressure, Amori Tor, Ryu's grandfather, finally broke through the final layer and stepped into the divine vessel realm. The momentum of his breakthrough swept over the higher mortal plane. He had finally become an expert those of the pedestal plane couldn't look down upon. Not just this, but he also gave hope to the Tor Kingdom. They finally felt there was a path to victory. They became the first sect with 2 divine vessel realm experts who would have known that their opponents wouldn't turn tail after this news reached their ears, but would instead continue to march forward. Before confusion could set on, Tor Kingdom soon became aware that the experts of the Nature's Emblem and Whispering Willow sects had set off to attack them as well. In that moment, the sects were evenly matched. Each side had 2 divine vessel realm experts and a comparable number of experts. However, while the sects were evenly matched, the same couldn't be said of kingdoms. The longer the battle stretched out, the more devastated the ancestral lands of the mighty Tor Kingdom became. It seemed like the perpetual dark clouds over their kingdom had finally come to collect their debts. So much blood was spilt that the skies seemed to soak in their color, becoming an eerie violet that made it feel as though purgatory was descending upon their lands. Just when it felt as though things couldn't get any worse, the Garrus clan once more launched a sneak attack, changing sides again and dealing what remained of the Tor clan a devastating blow. King Tor's rage reached an unmatched level. No one knew how he did it, but after years, he forcibly broke through, entering the spiritual severing realm. The Tor clan's iron body truly displayed its might, but unfortunately, one man wasn't enough to turn the tides. The Tor Kingdom wasn't just facing the flip of the Garrus clan, but also the Wydrek's deep pockets. It seemed as though every hidden and unaffiliated expert of their higher mortal plane was now flying under Wydrek's banner. When the Tor clan wanted to seek revenge on what remained of the Garrus clan, they were shocked to find that what remained of the Garrus clan had already relocated and sworn their allegiance to Opes Kingdom. Not only was the old general and young mistress Yana nowhere to be found, but even concubine Selene and Catalina and inexplicably vanished. It felt as though everything that could go wrong did go wrong. An invisible hand blanketed the skies, playing with their lives as they saw fit. At times like this, many Tor citizens began to wonder just where their heaven-defying crown prince had gone. Didn't he always win no matter what odds stood stacked against him? Where was he when they needed him most? On this particular day, more than 90% of Tor Kingdom's territory had been snatched away. What remained of their armies were battered back time and time again. Soon, all that remained were the tall walls of Tor City. What once was a vibrant capital city was now desolate. With so many battles having been fought, the mighty Tor clan had become nothing but a cornered rat. If it wasn't for fear of being executed on sight, what families remained would have long since defected. The guards that stood at the gates of Tor City were shifty-eyed and nervous beyond compare, a far cry from the arrogant, sharp gazes they once held. They couldn't take their eyes off the horizon. At any moment, they felt like the dust clouds of an approaching army could enter their senses. Once that happened, their fates would be sealed. So, when these guards saw a shadow slowly approaching them, their first reaction was despair. However, when that figure drew closer, shock, then a faint excitement colored their features. The Crown Prince had returned. He could turn this around right. At this moment, King Tor sat on his throne. One sleeve of his elaborate robes was decidedly empty, making it clear that he had lost an arm. Not a single hair of lush brown remained, all of them having been replaced by dull grays. He didn't even have the energy to get angry anymore. The fate of his father was unknown. The current head of the heavenly body sect was incredibly old to begin with, so his combat prowess wasn't like what it used to be. This put a heavy burden on King Tor's father in their battle. However, no one had heard word about what happened to those 4 divine vessel realm experts since their battle began. Around King Tor sat what remained of his empire. After the matters with the Cedar clan, most of the ministers had been executed, including Imperial Censor Briggs. So only Imperial Censor Digby remained, but his frail, old and skinny frame seemed like it could collapse at any moment. Aside from him, there were the 2 princesses, concubine Leilani, Queen Olivia, the first and third prince, and the nephew and niece of King Tor. At this point, King Tor couldn't bring himself to kill Olivia, not because he loved her, but because the kingdom couldn't suffer any more blows. The death of the queen might be the straw that broke the camel's back. Still, it seemed like they were all waiting for death. At that moment, the sealed doors of the throne room opened. Considering how silent the room had been, the swishing of such large doors immediately caught all of their attentions. However, what really shocked them was the figure who was behind that door, Crown Prince Ryu Tor. When King Tor laid eyes on Ryu's piercing gaze, he inexplicably began to laugh. It was a laugh filled with remorse and regret. There wasn't any rage or indignation. There was only resignation and sadness. In that instant, he understood exactly who controlled that looming invisible hand that seemed to cover the skies. The 2 princesses trembled seeing Ryu. It seemed that they too understood something at that moment. Their husbands had already died in the war between the 3 sects. Now the Tor clan was all they had to rely on. Even though they had Garrus blood, they weren't shameless enough to take advantage. At this moment, everyone understood what true fear was. A man toyed with their lives without lifting a single finger. This was Ryu Tatsuya. Ryu's eyes swept over those present. Unsurprisingly, after the lesson they were taught a year ago, Mai and Hagen no longer dared to attempt to fight Ryu. Instead, their small bodies shivered under his gaze. Ryu had no reason to appear before their eyes. He could have simply snuck in, just like he had for the other 3 kingdoms. However, it seemed that some part of what remained of the youthful him needed this moment. Though his 1,000 years' worth of memories had mostly overridden his 14 years of memories here, there was still a lingering portion. If Ryu didn't deal with this now, it could fester into a heart demon that would impede him later on. Today the Tor clan will fall. Ryu spoke plainly. However, I don't have a mind to thoughtlessly slaughter you all. I want to make it clear that had it not been for Granny Miriam's death, the only person I cherished in this life, I wouldn't have bothered to deal with you all at all. The lofty disdain in Ryu's eyes was something that pierced through each and every one of them. They could see it in his eyes. He really didn't care much for any of them at all. These words hurt his elder sisters the most. There was a point in time where they had been the only ones who even cared that he existed, yet they had stabbed him in the back. Now he didn't even care enough to take revenge against them. Were they really not even equal to Death Guard Bishak in his eyes? At least Ryu mercifully gave him a swift death. But now they as weak women had to carry this on their shoulders for the rest of their life. They felt as though the world was crumbling above them. Blood drained from their frail skin with each passing moment. It hurt just to look at Ryu. Leilani. Ryu's so-called mother shivered at Ryu's cold tone, not able to lift her gaze and look toward him. She felt too much shame. I am a man who repays his debts. Since you carried me for 9 months and suffered untold pain to birth me, I've arranged for you to live out the rest of your days in peace under the protection of the Opes and Garrus clan. You won't suffer any hardships. Dahlia and Isla, you will never be worthy of being my elder sisters. However, your 2 children, Mai and Hagen, are innocent of the actions of their parents. I've arranged places for them within the 4 Kingdoms Institute. How far they go is up to them. How much they support you is also up to them. You 2 will never receive my direct aid as you are unworthy. Dahlia and Isla trembled, tears falling from their eyes. They didn't feel any relief toward Ryu's words. Instead, it became clear to him that this was his way to sever all ties with them. Kaden Amori. We were born as brothers in this life, but you've never treated me as such. Since power was more important to you than brotherly ties, continue to seek it. It has nothing to do with me. Shuren, Ryu looked toward his so-called father. Consider my sparing your life as the final severance of our path as father and son. You gave life to me, and now I've given life to you. What you do with that life has nothing to do with me. Ryu's hands tore apart his upper garment, revealing his flawlessly sculpted chest. He pressed his right thumb against his forefinger, forcing his thumb's nail to protrude as far out as it could go comfortably. In that next moment, whether by their will or not, those whose names Ryu called out closed their eyes. All they heard was the faint sound of tearing flesh and dripping blood, as Ryu drew a bloody cross over his heart. By the time they opened their eyes, all that remained of Ryu's presence were 2 drops of blood, sitting on the floors of the otherwise pristine throne room. The matters went just as Ryu predicted. The 3 kingdoms' armies pushed forward with naked abandon, charging to and crushing the lofty Tor walls. By the time they appeared, King Tor had already disappeared, leaving behind the corpse of Queen Olivia and what remained of the royal family. Shockingly, they were spared. Leilani was taken into the Opes kingdom and given a small, peaceful villa to live out the rest of her days. Mai and Hagen went on to the 3 Kingdoms Institute. Their mothers never recovered from their depression and passed away just half a year later. As for Kaden and Amori, rumors had it that they left to the middle mortal plane. As the heirs of the Tor clan, they would never have a place on this highest mortal plane. In the end, the heavenly body sect was laid to ruin. The sect master died in battle, while Amori Tor escaped, and soon attempted the trial of the immortal path. Since his Tor clan was no more, there was no point in him remaining on the highest mortal plane, so he took his chances on the pedestal plane. No one knew whether he survived or not, but it was safe to say that the tales of Amori Tor, at least on this plane, had come to an end. The territory of Tor Kingdom was immediately split 3 ways. From now on, there would only be the 3 kingdoms of the highest mortal plane. The 4th was no more. Asterisk as these matters came to pass, Ryu could be found under what remained of the abandoned Tor Kingdom, seeking out the final and 4th piece of the Zhu clan's crystalline jade. Unsurprisingly, the spiritual chi pool found beneath to the Tor clan had a much lower height than the previous 3. Clearly, King Tor and many of the predecessors had been coming here frequently, just as Ryu predicted long ago. Originally, Ryu thought that they had been trying to whittle down the Kai pool by cultivating, but it seemed he had overestimated them far too much. Mental realm cultivation, or at least true mental realm cultivation, was practically extinct on the mortal planes. In fact, it was incredibly rare on the immortal planes as well. But what Ryu found below absolutely shocked him. The underground area looked identical to that of the other 3 kingdoms, but there were 2 major differences. The first was that the Kai pool was more than 3/4 gone, and the second was that the area was filled beautiful, shimmering flowers. When Ryu realized what these flowers were, he wanted to facepalm despite his usual cold demeanor. These flowers were known as spirit-seeking lilies. They had 6 beautiful petals. Just like common lilies, however, they had a high affinity for spiritual chi. Over several hundred years, the Tor clan had been constantly swapping these spirit herbs in and out, realizing that they could absorb what was in the Kai pool. It wasn't this action itself that Ryu found foolish. In truth, the plan was actually quite clever. The issue was that the Tor clan had no idea what the value of spirit-seeking lilies were. Ryu could see traces of shredded and trampled upon petals everywhere. Clearly, they treated these spirit herbs as disposable trash, when in reality, these herbs had an even higher value than the breaking ore Ryu took from the coronation games. Spirit-seeking lilies weren't a spirit herb that Ryu was unfamiliar with. In fact, it could be said that they were responsible for him living a long life, despite being unable to cultivate during his first life. On the surface, mental realm cultivation was useless to the lower levels of the cultivation world. Even to the higher levels, It's a mere supplementary skill. The secrets of mental realm cultivation were tightly guarded by clans like the Zhu clan. So after their banishment and banning, mental realm cultivation fell to the very corners of martial world society. However, Ryu was aware of just how important mental realm cultivation was to the foundation of a cultivator. In Ryu's first life, everything began normally. He lived through his first 150 years without much issue, and even crossed his 200th birthday with ease. But when he neared his 300th year, he began to experience some problems. He would often experience severe night terrors, his motivation to do anything his rock bottom, and he began to wonder if life was even worth living anymore. Considering Ryu's personality, he obviously tried his best to hide this from his parents, not wanting them to worry. But how could a mere mortal hide things from individuals with his parents' level of cultivation? In the end, his parents found out and they were devastated. These matters continued for a few dozen years. No one could find out what was wrong with Ryu. He seemed perfectly healthy. Eventually, Ryu's parents had no choice but to call upon an ancestor of the Ice Phoenix clan, an older woman who ranked even above Ryu's grandma Kyukin. Considering the ice flame of their Phoenix clan, women like Ryu's grandmother and this old ancestor were all renowned healers. It was this woman that figured out what was wrong with Ryu. The answer was simple. Mortals weren't meant to live for so long. The reason the heavens cut the lifespan of mortals short wasn't because it was cruel, but rather because mortals didn't have the capacity to withstand such a long life. The only solution she had was for Ryu to cultivate. But how could Ryu cultivate? He was born with a false spiritual foundation. He couldn't even sense Kai. There was only one path to turn down, and that was mental realm cultivation. But obviously, with its banning, there were no materials, even in shrine library, on the matter. It was then that Ryu stumbled upon spirit-seeking lilies. Just a small percentage of one of its petals caused Ryu's mental realm to surge to life. In fact, if it wasn't for spirit-seeking lilies, how could Ryu ever have comprehended Breath of Earth in his first life? Ryu understood at that moment exactly what had been wrong with him. The reason mortals couldn't withstand such long life was because they didn't have the mental fortitude of cultivators. Even when cultivators didn't focus on their mental realm, it would imperceptibly strengthen as they continued along their path. But obviously, Ryu hadn't been cultivating. Simply put, spirit-seeking lily saved Ryu's life. There were multiple kinds of spirit-seeking lily. The nomenclature of these different kinds depended on the color of their veins. Gold vein lilies were what saved Ryu's life. They had the ability to passively and gently increase the bounds of one's mental realm. Your first leaf would increase your mental realm by 10%. You would then receive diminishing returns, falling by 10% every time until you reached 1%. The magic of these lilies was that no matter how many you ingested, the return would never fall beneath 1%. Silver vein lilies focused on meditation. One could take them when on the verge of a breakthrough in cultivation or comprehension. According to legend, there were 9 states of meditation. The meditation state: breath of earth, breath of heaven, breath of world, one with self, one with earth, one with heaven, one with world, and breath of quintessence. A silver vein was able to directly send you into a higher state for every petal you consumed, up to a maximum of 6 corresponding to its 6 petals. This meant that if one could enter the breath of heaven state under your own power, eating 6 silver vein lilies would send you to the highest state of meditation immediately. The only drawback to silver vein lilies was that even if you used them, the time limit you were constrained to were limited by your own abilities. For example, Ryu could only enter breath of heaven for a few seconds. So, if he took 6 petals immediately following that, he would only be able to experience breath of quintessence for that same few seconds. This meant that if one was untalented to the point of not even being able to enter the simplest meditation state under their own power, then these silver vein lilies were practically useless to you. One also had to consider that entering states of meditation wasn't something everyone could do at will. In fact, Ryu was an exceptionally rare case. He felt like this ability of his was tied to his heavenly pupils, which seemed to err on the side of boosting comprehension. All of this meant that silver vein lilies were generally less desirable than golden vein lilies, but they were still a great treasure. However, for Ryu, he was the most excited about the silver vein lilies he saw here. One might think that Ryu was wasting too much time in strengthening himself. It had been years since he began cultivating, yet even with the help of the origin flame, he was only the heir of one inheritance. Wasn't that too pitiful? This was especially maddening considering he had a heavenly wind. Why hadn't he become a wind inheritor yet? The answer was simple. The power of one's natural order depended on the inheritance, also known as path, you were following. The reason Ryu's Tatsuya saintly weapons were so powerful was precisely because he was following the path laid out by his Tatsuya ancestors. If Ryu just wanted to become a wind heir, it would be frighteningly simple for him. After all, not to mention his northern heavenly wind, he had reached the great circle of perfection with his gliding cloud steps. However, Ryu didn't want to settle for mediocrity. Ryu didn't just want to become any wind heir. He wanted to become a heavenly wind heir and comprehend the inheritance of his northern heavenly wind. The issue was that not only was doing such a thing incredibly difficult, the path was incredibly vague due to the fact Ryu only had an embryo. Even with Breath of Earth and his heavenly pupils, he couldn't comprehend anything. However, these silver vein lilies changed everything. Now, he could rely on them to sink into a deeper state of comprehension. Once he did, grasping the path of the northern heavenly wind wouldn't be impossible anymore. He had a chance. If he succeeded, his battle prowess would skyrocket. Ryu lightly smiled. Things were going well. After retrieving the final crystalline jade piece, he would go and take the immortal path trial. Considering the path wasn't qualified to pressure him, it would be a breeze. Then, he'd finally set foot on the immortal plains once more. As he was thinking to this point, he suddenly froze. He only knew about gold and silver vein lilies. So why did he see ones with black veins here? Ryu's eyes trained on the black vein lilies. Suddenly, he felt his pupils pulsing. It wasn't painful but rather incredibly comfortable. Ryu could feel their excitement. These black vein lilies, they have some connection to my heavenly pupils. Ryu turned pensive for a moment. The good news about the mental realm path was that its rules differed from the body and chi paths, just like how mental realm techniques didn't restrict who could use them by cultivation level. So too did their spirit herbs not restrict their consumption. This meant that Ryu could ingest these lilies without fear of imploding from too much excess energy. This wasn't because mental realm type spirit herbs didn't have a lot of energy within them. Rather, it was because spiritual chi was the closest thing to essence that was readily available. Essence was the purest energy in existence and was what made natural orders so powerful. As for spiritual chi, it was especially gentle in its natural form. If it wasn't for the fact the spiritual chi pool was made up of incredibly concentrated kai, it wouldn't be dangerous either. So Ryu wasn't worried about ingesting the unknown black vein lily. However, he had a better path to take, the Zhu clan library. The only problem was that this wouldn't be a sure solution. After all, heavenly pupils were in their infant stages during the time of the Zhu clan, so they might not have information on why his pupils would be excited. Still, it was better to check than to blindly take an unknown herb. Putting this to the back of his mind, Ryu carefully put away the spirit-seeking lilies away one by one. Because of how gentle they were, he could directly bring them into his incubator, though it took several minutes per flower. Still, it was worth it. With the help of the incubator, the effects of the petals would be even more potent. In addition, he could continuously rely on the incubator to produce more lilies. The maturation of spirit-seeking lilies depended on both time and spiritual chi abundance. Their life had two phases. The first was the growth phase, and the second was the absorption phase. The growth phase took 10,000 years. After this 10,000-year period, the lily would then need a set amount of spiritual chi to reach full maturation. After being upgraded by Origin Essence during Ryu's Rite of Origin, the incubator's growth acceleration had increased from 100 times to 1,000 times. Though this was incredibly slow by the standard of the Shrine Plane, growth acceleration wasn't what made the incubator such a great treasure. This meant that from a seedling to the end of its growth phase, Ryu would need to nurture the lilies for 10 years. Then it could proceed to absorb spiritual chi. Luckily, Ryu had now created a small lake of spiritual chi, meaning it would only take a few days after this 10-year period for the lilies to be ready. At this moment, Ryu's incubator had regained some of its beauty. The lush grass was still present, along with the long, snaking river. But now the heart of the incubator had a man-made lake of spiritual chi, surrounded by beautiful, multicolored lilies. As of now, Ryu had 45 gold vein lilies, 36 silver vein lilies, and 7 black vein lilies. This corresponded to 270 gold petals, 216 silver petals, and 42 black petals. Ryu also believed that it was possible for the Tor clan to have a greater deposit, so he'd take his time to find them later. With that, he got to work. Even with the unexpected gain of the spirit-seeking lilies, what made his heart palpitate more than anything else was the prospect of completing the Zhu clan's crystalline jade. Due to the Tor clan's interference, Ryu had much less work to do. Since only 1/4 remained, it would take him a bit more than a month at most to get to the bottom. Time ticked by, and the higher mortal plane settled into a new balance. There were too many strong cultivators remaining in the heavenly body sect for the nature's emblem, and the Whispering Willow sects to take them all out. Although their greed was trained upon their resources, the Opes kingdom unexpectedly made a move to take the heavenly body sect under their wing. With the support of the Garis clan's army, the Opes kingdom was too powerful to provoke wantonly, especially with what remained of the heavenly body sect backing them. As such, the plane gained a new balance, going from the older 4 kingdoms and 4 sects to 3 kingdoms and 3 sects. Sometime weeks later, Ryu finally reached the bottom of the spiritual chi pool, smiling lightly as he held the final piece in his hand. He had slaved for almost 2 years for these 4 pieces. His 18th birthday was already quickly approaching, but he felt like it was all worth it. It wasn't just the resources of the Zhu clan that were so great. One had to remember that the mind worked much faster than the body did. For a normal mortal, experiencing things at 2 to even 3 times normal speed in one's mind wouldn't make much of a difference. This was even more exaggerated for a mental realm cultivator like Ryu. He could experience things at up to 10 times the speed without much effort. What did this mean? This crystalline jade was incredibly special. It allowed one to project their minds into a realm where you could train. This meant that Ryu could experience 10 times the comprehension speed by relying on this crystalline jade. Of course, this wouldn't impact his cultivation speed. After all, it was just something his mind was experiencing, not his actual body. However, this hardly diminished the value. With this crystalline jade's help, even if Ryu's cultivation speed was increased, it would greatly decrease the time he needed to master techniques and comprehend natural orders. It was invaluable. Ryu took out the remaining 3 pieces. Just as he was about to allow them to fuse together, his expression turned grave. He realized immediately that he made a mistake, but it was already too late. The jade pieces shot together against his will, emitting a blinding light as it finally formed a cohesive whole after almost 2 years of Ryu's hard work. In that moment, a seal branded itself into Ryu's chest. A searing pain that reached down to his soul caused his body to quiver. Even Ryu, who believed himself to have a high pain tolerance, couldn't help but roar out in anguish even as the jade fell onto his palm. During that exact same instant of time, an old, wrinkled man's eyes shot open, shining a piercing light. An oppressive cultivation aura shot out from within him, shattering the garden platform he sat upon. Someone's finally found it. Destroying that arrogant natural order sect was definitely the right move. The old man shot into the skies, cutting through the air toward Ryu's location. If Ryu had been there, he would have been incomparably shocked, because this man was none other than Headmaster Leopold. I think I missed a 50 golden ticket bonus chapter. I'm not entirely sure. If so, oops. If not, well, you guys lucked out. Elmao Ryu calmed his erratically beating heart. At this moment, he had no idea that Headmaster Leopold was careening toward him at a speed even divine vessel realm experts would look up in awe at. Nor did he know that Headmaster Leopold was responsible for the destruction of the Natural Order sect. But what he did know was that he was in incomparable danger, even if he didn't know it was under Headmaster Leopold's threat specifically. He knew that someone was coming toward him at their fastest possible speed. This much was inevitable. What a good Zhu clan. Ryu sneered, but it was pointed less toward the Zhu clan itself and more toward himself. He had been too naive and too blinded by benefits. He should have known that the Zhu clan wouldn't so easily allow their treasures to fall into the hands of outsiders. The moment the pieces fused together, they triggered a hidden seal within. The path of sealing was an incredibly rare sub-branch of formation masters. In fact, it had fallen well past its previous peak, because of the banishment of mental realm masters. Sealing could only be done by those with incredibly profound mental realms. Ryu didn't need to think much to understand what kind of seal had been placed on him. It was most definitely a tracking seal, and it was likely one with an incredibly long range, or else, why would the Zhu clan even bother to make it? Calming himself, Ryu thought of the facts he knew now. First, he had a seal on himself that allowed Zhu clan remnants to sense his location. Second, this seal didn't seem to have any other function. One would assume that if it could directly take control of Ryu, it would have already done so. The fact it hadn't was likely because the Zhu clan knew it would be a very long time before the seal was put to use, and thus the less complex it was, the more chances it had to succeed. That final deduction led to a third conclusion that gave Ryu some hope. This seal was definitely much weaker than it had been in its inception. However, Ryu didn't have any delusions that it would be easily dealt with. One had to remember that the 4 pieces of crystalline jade were all submerged beneath large pools of spiritual qi. What was the best nourishment for a mental realm technique? Was it not, in fact, spiritual qi? What do I do? An eerie calm came over Ryu. Panicking would do him no good. At that moment, a cool kai seeped from Ryu's eyes to his mind before diffusing throughout his body. Unfortunately, Ryu was too focused on his train of thought to notice. Ryu knew that his first priority should be getting rid of the seal, but was putting his efforts toward this goal worth it? Meaning, could he, at his weak cultivation realm, do anything about such a seal to begin with? And if he couldn't, then shouldn't his first priority be instead to run? Ryu quickly ran through all of his options. Did he have the ability to get rid of the seal? A swirl of spatial kai emitted from Ryu's eyes, swallowing up the crystalline jade into his inner realm. The incubator had fused with Ryu's right eye, but his left eye was still connected to the inner realm all those with heavenly pupils were born with. Since they dared to play with his life like this, he would destroy their hopes and dreams. If Ryu died, his inner realm would naturally be destroyed along with him and everything in it. This way, no matter what happened today, the Zhu clan would lose. Since when had he, Ryu Tatsuya, ever suffered a loss? If this would be the day, he'd take his enemy down with him. Ryu racked his brain. Wait, Ryu's eyes shone like burning torches in the dead of night. His hands moved quickly, causing a small, imperceptible flash of light to emit from his spatial ring, and resulting in a dagger appearing in his palm. This dagger could only be described as a beautiful work of art. Its jagged edge was a gorgeous crystalline blue. Its spine was a deep, rich black that absorbed all the light that bounced along it, and its handle had an elegant curl to it such that it fit perfectly into one's hand. This dagger was none other than the unique grade treasure Ryu's wife, Alina, had given him as a birthday present. She too didn't know the true extent of its abilities, but she did know one thing. It was an incredibly rare tool capable of attacking one's mental realm directly. Ryu ripped his robe apart, revealing his perfectly sculpted chest. However, this time it wasn't blemishless, just center-left. What looked like a burning brand mark lay plastered upon it. Taking the piece of torn fabric, Ryu firmly clenched his teeth around it. This mark was firmly etched above his heart. With each passing moment, it only dug deeper. If he waited any longer, he would have to destroy the whole of his heart before he could even think of getting it out. Sweat matted his forehead, but he didn't any longer. His spiritual chi surged into the blade, causing its blue, crystalline edge to glow fiercely with excitement. And then, a maddened flicker swept through Ryu's eyes as he resolutely pierced downward. Muffled cries left Ryu's lips, fighting their way through the fabric he held between them and filling the underground space. If anyone could see this scene, they would most definitely think that Ryu was insane, piercing your own heart, and so deeply. For someone of Ryu's poor cultivation grade, the only path left was death. This didn't even mention the damage the blade was currently doing to his mental realm. Ryu's consciousness seemed like it would fade at any moment. The pain was too severe. However, Ryu realized something incomparably frightening at that moment. The seal had stopped boring into him any further, but it wasn't destroyed. At best, it was weakened by 20%. That may cut down its range, but considering how strong the signal was to begin it, what did that even count for? Headmaster Leopold's eyes narrowed when he sensed the seal suddenly weaken. He spurred on his greatest movement technique to its greatest height, causing his speed to shoot upward another 50%. He couldn't allow this person to disappear. A bitter laugh escaped Ryu's lips. With his pitiful mental realm talent, how could his spiritual chi be enough to completely destroy such a seal, even if it was weakened? Now he stood with a blade in his heart, his life force quickly dissipating, all while an unknown enemy was quickly approaching. Maybe this was just the cycle of life. In the past 2 years, who knows how many countless innocents Ryu's plots killed, all for the revenge of a single Granny Miriam. Maybe the universe was coming to collect now. In Opes Kingdom, a magnificent villa's window displayed the image of a beautiful young Yana, sighing to herself. Why was it that this night sky seemed so bland today? Why are you up so late, little Nunu? The old general lightly knocked on his granddaughter's door. He had noticed that the lights in Yana's room had yet to go out, but the moon was already high in the sky. The past few months had been exceptionally peaceful. The Garis clan was finally free. The old general's bedridden daughter, Selena, had finally awoken from her coma, and the Garis clan had gained a stable, well-respected foothold in the Opes Kingdom. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that these were the happiest days of the Garis clan. Where do you think Ryu is right now, Grandpa? Yana asked lightly. The old general sighed from the other side of the door. It could be said that these would have been his happiest days, had his granddaughter not been acting like this recently. He shouldn't be surprised that this was all about a boy. Yana was already almost 19. She was around that age. Little Nunu, I know it's hard, but Grandpa doesn't believe it's possible for you to see Ryu again in this lifetime. You two simply live in 2 different worlds. Soon, he'll be stepping upon the path of immortals. Yana's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Her grandfather's words were harsh, but they were the truth. Yana's cultivation had always been poor. It wasn't that she didn't try, but rather that she was no good at it. Even after almost 12 years, trying for at least 6 to 8 hours a day, she was at the mere second awakening realm. You're right, Grandpa, Yana said lightly. I don't have to get married anymore, right? In all honesty, the old general had planned to play matchmaker between Yana and the first Opes prince. He didn't plan on forcing it, but he already knew that Kalman had taken a liking to his little granddaughter. Maybe feelings would develop between them in time, but they had gone through all of this trouble so that the Garis clan could finally be free. With such a request coming from his granddaughter, how could he ignore it? That would make him subhuman. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, little Nunu. The old general finally replied seriously, but don't hold yourself back from your own happiness either. Yana understands Grandpa. The light footsteps of the old general walking away were the only sounds that permeated the villa as Yana looked into the skies. Since her and Ryu weren't meant to be in this life, she'd silently accept her fate. In truth, Yana continued to try every day without pause. In fact, she doubled her efforts, often spending more than half a day cultivating. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be until she was 30 that she finally reached the third awakening realm. And not until 50 that she reached the fourth. Some things simply weren't meant to be. Yana would become an older woman. Though it would pain her when her grandfather passed away, she found happiness in other ways. She became the warm-hearted saintess of Opes Kingdom, and a most loved cousin aunt of Wydrek's children. Her name would be passed on through generations of Opes Kingdom citizens, much like Granny Miriam's was. However, she would often think back to that cold, handsome young man with a head of long white hair. His valiant figure would warm her bed at night and soothe her erratic thoughts, and she would always wonder just why the sky was so bland that night. Asterisk, maybe there truly was some small line of fate tying Yana and Ryu, because her feeling of discomfort was directly tied with the fading of Ryu's life force. However, Ryu had too many things to fight for. Even as his life was slipping away from him, his eyes shone with a maddened light, the very same feeling of recklessness that forced him into taking on 4 rights simultaneously. Since he was meant to die here, why not go all out? Suddenly, Ryu's eyes flashed. The incubator can be used in this way as well. Come then. In Ryu's madness, he recklessly attempted to pour the reserves of spiritual chi from within the spiritual lake he formed at the center of his incubator's independent world, fully expecting his mental realm to swell like balloon and burst. But who would have known that the incubator's ability to make volatile energies gentle would extend to this pool as well? It wasn't that Ryu was a fool. One might think that something seemingly so obvious shouldn't have escaped the notice of a supposed genius. However, this matter wasn't so intuitive as it seemed. Ryu spent much of his life researching all sorts of topics to be the best ruin master he could be. In fact, the only reason he even learned the concepts of feng shui and herbology were because they were incredibly useful in streamlining the ruin raiding process. This was all to say that Ryu intuitively understood many things about treasures, even if he didn't have the ability to forge them himself. He had assumed that the incubator's special nature was tied to its soil. This was likely why, even though the Holy Wing clan dared to take everything else out, they left the grass and the soil of the incubator. By this logic, only things that could be properly planted within and receive nourishment from the soil could be privy to its abilities. However, the spiritual chi obviously didn't fall under this category. It wasn't until now Ryu understood just how heaven-defying his incubator was. The secret wasn't hidden within the soil, but was rather in the construction of the incubator itself. In fact, Ryu suspected that this treasure wasn't even meant to be used as an incubator in the first place. This was likely why its herb growth acceleration's abilities were so poor in comparison to the treasures available on the shrine plain. Ryu laughed. He finally saw a ray of hope. If this gentle nature of the incubator wasn't limited to just spiritual herbs that could be planted into its soil, then that meant there were other energies it could gently extract. For example, healing pills. Ryu immediately took out dozens of bottles of pills he took from the Natural Order sect. He hadn't used these during the coronation games because he was purposely testing his limit, but now he definitely needed them. These pills were of the black grade, and thus useful for chi refinement and spiritual severing realm experts. With the incubator's ability to extract energy, their uses would not only be gentle, but also far more effective than usual. In addition, Ryu wouldn't have to worry about their impurities. With one portion of his mind, Ryu continuously replenished his mental realm of exhausted spiritual chi. With the other, he continuously funneled healing energies to his heart, continuously revitalizing his withering life force. 80%, 79%. The seal was being slowly chipped away with each passing moment. Headmaster Leopold immediately sensed that the seal was slowly weakening once more, causing the frown on his wrinkled face to deepen. How formidable could this enemy be that they were capable of such a thing? Leopold might just be a member of a small remnant branch of the Zhou clan, but he was well aware of just how powerful that seal was himself. If the enemy was so powerful, he suddenly didn't have the confidence that he could win even with his current cultivation. Still, he could only redouble his efforts. He had wasted so many years of his life on this pitiful mortal plane. Valuable cultivation time was wasted. Even if he had to put his life on the line, what did it matter? If you weren't willing to risk everything, could you even call yourself a cultivator? At this very moment, the ferocious expression on Ryu's features hadn't faded. If anything, it was growing fiercer by the minute. Anyone else would have likely given way by now. No normal pulse-opening realm expert's body could withstand having their heart cut open for so long. However, Ryu wasn't normal. For one, with 4 ancestral beast bloodlines, Ryu's vitality was easily 10 times more than anyone else of his cultivation realm. Simply put, he could survive in a near death for much longer than another individual of his prowess. Still, the second aspect was likely even more important than the first. There were no two bloodlines better at preservation than Ryu's ice and fire phoenix bloodlines. One was tied to the life shrine, while the other was tied to the reincarnation shrine. How could they be simple by any stretch of the imagination? None of this even mentioned Ryu's ice jade crystal bone structure, which was beloved by the heavens. If he gave up so easily when his life was on the line, Ryu would be too pathetic. 60%, 56%, 49%. The weaker the seal became, the more fleeting Ryu's life seemed to become. His frame shrunk. Under the constant prodding of his deepest reserves, much of the strength he had accumulated in his limbs went directly toward preserving his life. But he continued to fight. Headmaster Leopold could sense the connection he had weakening. Before, he felt that as long as he got to within 1,000 kilometers of Ryu, he would be able to pin down an exact location. But now, he could only sense the general area with Ryu had the highest possibility of being. The plains, even the mortal plains, were simply too large. What remained of Tor Kingdom was located in one corner of the plain, while Headmaster Leopold's Three Kingdom Institute was located at the very center. One had to remember that it took Ryu, with the help of the northern heavenly wind, months to travel from Tor Kingdom to Opes Kingdom. Back then, his speed had already been comparable to a normal chi refinement expert. Even with Leopold's cultivation, it would still take him almost 3 hours to make it to Ryu's location. 41%, 35%, 27%. Damn it! Headmaster Leopold roared. Let alone a general location. As of now, he could only sense Ryu's general direction and had a vague understanding of how much further he had to go. 2 hours had already passed, but Leopold was still several hundred kilometers from Ryu. Even still, Leopold had no idea that not only was the expert, he was chasing after someone he could kill with a single thought, but that this expert's life was already hanging on by a mere small thread. Ryu's face was completely drained of blood. His once well-defined frame had shrunk to the point of his skin, tugging tightly against his rib cage. Even his heart, stabbed as it was, only managed to beat once every few seconds. If one could see this scene, they'd be baffled by the fact Ryu was even still standing at this point. However, Ryu knew he couldn't fall. He mustn't fall. It might seem like everything would be over the moment the seal was gone, but Ryu was no fool. Whoever was likely coming after him now was a member of the Zhou clan. If this was true, that meant they were a mental realm expert. And a mental realm expert with far greater cultivation than Ryu at that. What did this mean? Would a mental realm expert have a spiritual sense range as pitiful as Ryu's mere 30 meters and 3 centimeters? Of course not. For whoever it was to be assigned the task of retrieving the last hope of the Zhou clan, they had to be one of the most powerful experts the clan had remaining. In that case, having a spiritual sense range of several dozen kilometers was likely the minimum. 23%, 18%, 11%. This person likely already knew Ryu's general location. As long as he was within 100 kilometers of Ryu, there was no escaping him. One had to remember that Ryu was in the completely abandoned Tor Kingdom. Aside from a few stragglers and small human tribes, no one was left in this region. Soon, the three kingdoms would likely split this territory among them. But this was a matter for the future after they finished licking their wounds. This meant that it was very much possible for Ryu to be the only soul within miles of himself. He couldn't rest no matter what. Even after this seal was gone, he had to run. He had to run for his life. 9%, 6%, 4%. Ryu roared, pushing out the last of what remained within him in the final stretch. "I've got you." Headmaster Leopold was still too far away for his spiritual sense to pick up on Ryu, especially since Ryu was underground. However, at that moment, he utilized one of the few techniques of the Zhu clan that had survived to this day: resonating sense. By melding your spiritual sense with the natural vibration of the air and nature, this technique's user would be able to multiply the range of their senses for a moment. In fact, this resonance made this technique especially good for seeing through barriers one might otherwise be unable to. 2%, 1%, 0%. Shockingly, Leopold realized that he still couldn't sense the person he was looking for. Just when he was about to despair, believing the Zhu clan's last hope had slipped from his hands, he realized something curious. There was a small segment spanning about 30 by 30 meters that his spiritual sense couldn't penetrate no matter how hard he tried. In that instant he understood. Whoever it was must be there. Beneath Tor Kingdom, Ryu pulled the dagger from his chest, revealing a ghastly wound. Staggering weakly from loss of blood, his vision swam. He knew he had to move, but why weren't his legs cooperating with him? Bonus chapter: for 100 golden tickets, Ryu stumbled, crashing into a wall of the underground passage. "Come on," he roared in his mind, begging his body to cooperate. The Natural Order sect wasn't a body realm sect like the Heavenly Body sect was. As such, the pills they had in this lane were very limited. Ryu had no choice but to take out the same blood-congealing pills he used to usher his body into the pulse-tempering realm. Unfortunately, since they were common-grade pills, and Ryu was on the verge of entering the vessel-tempering realm, they weren't as effective. Still, with the help of the incubator, Ryu realized that he was capable of making even useless pills heavenly treasures. Vital chi surged into his blood, revitalizing it from dormancy. Ryu felt his mind clearing, albeit to a small extent. Still, this was enough for him to regain his equilibrium. Ryu was once again in awe of the incubator, but he didn't have the time to think about it any longer. His entire focus was trained on one thought: run. A black cloak covered Ryu's body as he sprinted to the far wall. He once more felt around until he found a hidden mechanism similar to what was concealed beneath Opes Kingdom, opening a pathway toward what remained of Heavenly Body sect. Without another thought, he bolted down it. Ryu tried to spur on his cloak, attempting to forcibly enter a state of meditation to escape detection, but he could only smile bitterly when he realized his mental realm was completely spent. He couldn't achieve the level of focus he needed. He could only rely on the passive abilities of the cloak. When Ryu's wife, Alina, explained the properties of the cloak to him, she had said that if he entered Breath of Earth and stayed still, even she wouldn't be able to detect him. It had to be said that Ryu's wife, when she was last alive, was a Tao pedestal realm expert. However, there were two factors important here. First of all, she had very clearly said if Ryu didn't move. Obviously, Ryu wasn't in such a situation now. In all likelihood, the enemy already knew where he was. Secondly, Ryu couldn't even enter the lowest state of meditation, let alone enter Breath of Earth. To make matters worse, the essence the cloak relied on was much less pure in the mortal planes, meaning even if Ryu could enter Breath of Earth, there was no guarantee that the cloak would be just as effective as it was on the shrine plane. Everything seemed stacked against Ryu. Every path he took seemed blocked off. Even his northern heavenly wind could hardly counter the terrible condition his body was in. In his peak state, he could easily match the speed of a mortal plane lower spiritual severing realm expert. But now, even if he ignored the wind tearing his body apart, he would be lucky to match a peak chi refinement realm expect. Ryu burst out from the path. Everything seemed identical except for the fact Opes Kingdom was under a perpetual winter, while Tor Kingdom was the exact opposite. The massive rock that moved out of his way to allow him to exit was covered in moss, and unkempt shrubbery were sprawled all around. In the distance, the remains of the heavenly body sect laid barren. Countless destroyed pieces of once astounding architecture and improperly buried bodies strewn about. Ryu continued sprinting for his life, cutting directly through the sect. At that moment, he suddenly heard a concussive boom. The reverberating effects were so large that a gust of wind inadvertently helped Ryu surge forward at a greater pace. Several dozen miles away, the remains of Tor Palace came crashing down as Headmaster Leopold directly laid it all to waste. Ryu's third perspective didn't have a long enough range to witness this happen, but he could easily make some guesses. This person didn't come directly after me, but instead went to Tor Palace. There are two possibilities. The first is that he knew all along that the pieces were there, but didn't have my means to retrieve them, and could thus only wait for someone to collect the four for him. The second possibility is that he sensed my location, in which case, why is it that he doesn't know I'm no longer there? Ryu's brain worked in overdrive. Suddenly, he understood. If the locations of the four pieces were so easily found, then why hadn't any of the immortals who descended in the past found them? Obviously, there was a barrier of protection around them, stopping prying eyes. Knowing this, Ryu concluded that this person used the seal to find his general location, and realized there was an area he couldn't pry into perfectly. Thus, he concluded that Ryu must be there. As for why he could sense the seal through those protective seals, wouldn't the Zhu clan be too stupid if they created two mechanisms that conflicted with each other? In all likelihood, the seal's signal was the only sort of signal that could make it through those protections. But why did all of this matter? It mattered because it wouldn't be long before whoever crashed into Tor Palace would find the underground space. In that case, they would definitely find the secret passage Ryu ran out of, which also meant that they'd know where he was in a matter of minutes. Ryu grit his teeth, thinking about whether he should change directions. But in the end, he shook his head. He knew that his only chance for survival was in this very direction. Why was the heavenly body sect the most powerful of the four sects? Why was it that the Tor Kingdom also seemed to be the most powerful? It was precisely because they were located in a cultivation holy land. The corner of the higher mortal plane in which they were located was the closest corner to the legendary immortal path. So why was it that Ryu was running for his life toward this immortal path? It was because it was his best chance for survival. While he could ignore the trial of the immortal path because of his ancestral great circle, others couldn't do the same. The best part was that even though this was the path to the lowest immortal plane, it was still powerful, as long as his enemy was below the immortal ring realm, a mighty realm 2 realms above even the divine vessel realm. Ryu could flip this situation around. Ryu was very familiar with absolute experts. Since his enemy took 3 hours to reach his location and wasn't coming from the direction of the immortal path, it was impossible for him to be so powerful. At best, he would be of the connecting heaven realm. At this moment, Headmaster Leopold tore the grounds of the Tor Kingdom apart. But even with his strength, he suddenly reached a blockade below he couldn't blast through no matter how much he tried. He looked around frantically before his eyes landed on a fountain that somehow survived through all his devastation. In that moment, his eyes narrowed. Ryu pushed himself to his limits, his legs feeling as though they were steadily becoming more like cement blocks instead of the flesh and blood they were meant to be. The wind whipped against his skin, tearing into the ghastly, pulsating wound on his chest. One could only imagine the level of pain he was enduring. Every time his heart pumped to spur him onward, A gush of blood was spurted outward through the wound left by the dagger. A mortal would never be able to survive such a thing. In fact, neither should a mere pulse-opening realm expert like Ryu. However, the Ryu of this second lifetime was no longer here. After settling his final accounts with the Tor clan, the story of Ryu Tor had come to a close. What fueled him was no longer revenge for Granny Miriam, but a promise he made on a calm night more than 900 million years ago, a promise to his wife. Ryu didn't know where Alina was now. He wouldn't even be absolutely certain that she was alive until his mental realm entered the soul birth realm. But this didn't shake Ryu's resolve in the least. If she was alive, he would do everything in his power to reach her. If she was dead, he would drown those responsible in blood before following after her. This wasn't the place he, Ryu Tatsuya, was meant to die. Not here, not today. Headmaster Leopold's eyes trained on the fountain, even without Ryu's heavenly pupils. It only took him a bit of focus to realize that this fountain was protected by a formation. This wasn't much of a surprise, after all. Formation masters needed to cultivate their mental realm in order to see complete formations. This was obviously a step someone like Leopold already completed, his brows knit. Heaven-grade formation. No, not just any heaven-grade formation, but a half-step mystical-grade formation. Luckily, it's a small-scale formation and not a large one. In truth, Ryu's worst-case scenario came true. The unassuming headmaster Leopold was actually a mighty connecting heaven realm expert, a step above even the mightiest divine vessel realm expert of the higher mortal plane. However, one had to realize that formations worked much like techniques and pills did. Their grade decided which cultivation realms they were effective against. A common grade formation was effective for awakening and pulse-opening realm experts. This meant that an earth-grade formation was already effective against a divine vessel and connection heaven realm expert like Headmaster Leopold. Now, one can imagine why it took the peak spiritual severing realm experts of the Three Kings several days to destroy the large-scale Earth-grade formation of the Natural Order sect. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact there was no one manning the formation of the Natural Order sect, it would have been impossible for mere spiritual severing realm experts to do anything to it. Still, Headmaster Leopold had a chance for two reasons. Firstly, this was a makeshift small-scale formation that had been modified recently, causing its grade to fall from its peak height to the mere heaven grade. This was something Ryu himself realized when he first analyzed the fountain at Opes Kingdom. And secondly, a small-scale formation wasn't as robust as a large-scale one. Essentially, a small-scale formation was the equivalent in robustness to a large-scale formation, one step down from its grade. Without hesitation, Headmaster Leopold began to unleash attack after attack on the small-scale formation. When Ryu heard this in the distance, the faint light of hope grew even stronger because he realized that whoever was coming after him didn't have any knowledge of formations. Headmaster Leopold made a massive mistake. It was true that the fountain's formation was adjusted to accept the royal blood of the Tor, Opes, Viri, and Lantes kingdoms, but how could it not recognize Zhu clan blood as well? If he had taken a breath to think, the fountain would have easily allowed him to enter in exchange for a single scan. Yet he was unaware. This gave Ryu valuable time. Within the crystalline jade, the two empresses and emperors sat fairly complacently. But as more and more time passed, their brows furrowed. They had clearly sensed that the jade became perfect. So why hadn't their descendant come to pay respects to them yet? Don't tell them that a mere pulse-opening realm boy escaped their net. That was impossible. Unfortunately, they couldn't sense anything happening on the outside. If they moved too far from their incarnation jades, their souls would immediately start to dissipate. In fact, a heavenly punishment might even descend upon them. It seems we've underestimated this boy a bit, Malvar said plainly. Impossible, Flora said in her sweet voice. The dichotomy of how nice it sounded versus the killing intent clear within it was too much for any sane person to handle. After Big Sis gave him her immortal Sakura, his guard should have been lowered to the extreme. His guard has been up against us from the very beginning. Ska said blandly. Have you ever seen a pulse-opening realm child? Receiving a technique from a sky god remained so calm. He didn't even express any gratitude after accepting my immortal Sakura. The four ancestors fell into silence. In the outside world, Ryu had already shot through the heavenly body sect, bolting down its mountains. Apprehension gripped his heart as he closed in on the immortal path. Due to the influx of essence in the area, it was a hub for exceptionally powerful beasts. It wasn't impossible for a fifth-order beast king to appear here. There were even rumors of a sixth-order beast king. However, Ryu had no choice. The moment he entered this holy land of nature, he realized that this might be even more dangerous than what was following him to his back. If even the heavenly body sect didn't dare extend their territory's boundary into such a beautiful land, it was clear that even they could only bow their heads to whatever lived here. At that moment, Headmaster Leopold's assault on the fountain had continued for several hours. With a final shattering, the pitiful fountain was obliterated into fine dust particles, revealing a passage below. It didn't take Leopold more than a split moment to find the fountain, after raging over the missing crystalline piece. Without hesitation, he tore down the dark pathway, erupting out to appear among the remains of the heavenly body sect. He could sense a faint presence, so faint that he almost missed it completely. Every time he took his mind off of it for a moment, that presence would vanish. Ryu had a several-hour head start. He had all the plans in the world. Yet, the moment Headmaster Leopold's spiritual sense trained on him with resonating sense, it was already over. What did a several-hour head start mean in the face of absolute power? Ha ha. To think that my opponent all this time would be this little fourth Prince Tor. Ryu's cultivation wasn't deep enough to be qualified to sense Leopold's senses lock onto him. However, his heavenly pupils had no such limitations. The moment he felt a painful throb in his eye, he was immediately aware that his position had been locked onto. The determination on Ryu's face didn't diminish in the slightest. Because the lock Leopold had on him was fading in and out, Ryu understood that this meant he was out of Leopold's solidified spiritual sense range. This meant that Leopold was using a technique to temporarily boost his senses, a technique that, in all likelihood, he couldn't use continuously. In this case, Ryu still had a chance. After hours of running, Ryu had put several hundred miles between him and Leopold. Considering his estimate of Leopold's cultivation as at most a connecting heaven realm expert, this meant that Leopold was at most in the spiritual endowment realm, a step above Ryu's spiritual entrance realm mental cultivation. According to what Ryu understood, the normal range of a spiritual sense, even for an absolute genius of this realm, was at most a few dozen miles. It was impossible for Leopold's to be any larger. Of course, Ryu considered the very small chance that Leopold had entered the soul birth realm. In that case, he was very wrong. However, Ryu had learned a lot about mental realm cultivation recently. As such, he knew that before entering the immortal ring realm, a cultivator would choose to connect all of their pulses together, and all of their vessels together. Remember, before the connecting heaven realm came the divine vessel realm. Much like the pulse opening realm, this realm was all about opening hidden meridians. In the pulse opening realm, they were called pulses, but in the divine vessel realm, they were called vessels. In line with this, the second realm of mental cultivation opened the spiritual vessel, whereas before, it was called the spiritual pulse. On top of this, the second realm of body cultivation opened the body vessels, whereas before they were called body pulses. The connecting heaven realm was exactly what it sounded like. The greatest experts would link all 13 pulses and all 13 vessels before forming their immortal rings and entering the immortal ring realm. This was why Ryu was certain Leopold couldn't have entered the soul birth realm. Only a fool wouldn't first add their spiritual vessel into their immortal ring before progressing. Since Leopold wasn't in the immortal ring realm, he thus couldn't be in the soul birth realm. Still, this meant next to nothing to Headmaster Leopold. To him, Ryu was already a mouse trapped in a jar. He could obviously tell where Ryu was running to, but he was also certain that he would catch Ryu long before he reached his destination. Interesting. A burden fell from Leopold's heart. He thought he was facing some supreme expert, come to find out his opponent was a child. Your performance against the ice-eyed bear was quite intriguing to me. These country bumpkins of this mere mortal plane might not understand what happened, but I'm 95% certain you have a set of heavenly pupils. Headmaster Leopold laughed uproariously. He couldn't make a move before and risk exposing his position. But now that his main goal was right before him, what more worries did he have? Not only would he accomplish the wishes of his long-past ancestors, he would gain their treasures, and he would rise up to an all-new level once he implanted Ryu's heavenly pupils to replace his own eyes. This matter couldn't be any better. Leopold strode forward, covering several hundred meters in single steps. He moved more than 5 times faster than Ryu with a leisurely expression on his face. Still, he was moving at his top speed. Even if he had relaxed from his tense height, he was too excited to get his hands on Ryu's things. In the distance, Ryu himself was in a terrible situation. His speed continuously fell, his body continuously trying to shut down against his better wishes. Suddenly, Ryu laughed. His eyes turned a pulsing red color as he charged forward at a faster pace. His cloak was a mystical grade treasure. Even at this speed, there was little to no effect on it. However, the wind whipping across Ryu's face was tearing his once flawless features apart. Luckily, heavenly pupils were incredibly durable in comparison to normal eyes, or else Ryu would have been blinded in an instant. At this moment, Ryu was ignoring the limitations of his body, tapping into the northern heavenly wind's ability to boost his speed. Unfortunately, since his heavenly wind was a mere embryo, he couldn't perfectly meld into the wind, resulting in large portions of the air fiercely rejecting him and causing these ghastly injuries. Headmaster Leopold's eyes contracted. He immediately noticed that the speed at which he was closing in on Ryu had been drastically cut down. What just happened? Ryu roared with all his might, causing whatever small dregs of spiritual chi he had remaining to spur to life, as a miniature immortal Sakura appeared. It couldn't have been more than a foot high. No, it was barely half a foot high, while its beautiful translucent blossoms were even smaller. But still, Ryu forced them into existence. Ryu didn't do something as foolish as turn around and fight. Even with this immortal Sakura, he had no chance against the individual rushing after him now. No. He was using the immortal Sakura for a completely different purpose. You said even the wind cannot touch me without asking first, right? Well then show me. Ryu was well aware that Eska had said this would only be true if he reached the highest realm of immortal Sakura. But right now he was pissed off. He wanted revenge. Since they wanted to plot on him, he would make certain that the very reason he survived was the technique they gave him to trick him. Small, transparent blossom petals began to fall. They immediately shattered upon contacting the vicious gales whipping against Ryu. But just that small moment they survived alleviated a great amount of pressure on Ryu. However, at the same time, every petal that shattered was another backlash on Ryu's mental realm, causing a fierce decline in his already lacking stamina. Ryu continuously tapped into the spiritual chi pool within the incubator. So much blood had drained from his face that he looked no different from a walking skeleton. However, he pushed forward, from the speed of a peak chi refinement expert to the speed of a lower divine vessel expert. Headmaster Leopold's speed couldn't be said to be any more than 2 times faster than Ryu now. One had to know that Ryu's calculations of his equivalent speed now took into account the absolute upper limit of an agility-type genius of said cultivation level. This meant that if Ryu confidently said his speed could match a lower divine vessel realm expert now, he meant the fastest. Even Ryu himself didn't realize just how far he was going. He was comparing himself to shrine-playing geniuses. But could Headmaster Leopold be considered to be of that ilk? He was so old, yet he hadn't broken into the immortal ring realm yet. On the higher mortal plane, he was an absolute genius. But on the shrine plane, calling him trash would be giving him a compliment. On top of this, Headmaster Leopold was a mental realm expert. How could he be as fast as a connecting heaven realm cultivator who specialized in speed? This was why, despite having an entire cultivation layer difference between them, Headmaster Leopold could barely boast having twice Ryu's speed. Leopold's relaxed expression tightened, but soon he calmed once more. How could a mere pulse-opening realm cultivator possibly keep up this speed? Whatever technique or treasure Ryu was using definitely couldn't last long. And even if it did, he would pay a devastating price for it. He couldn't have been more correct. With every blossom petal that shattered, a severe, reverberating backlash whipped across Ryu's mental realm. Considering the state of despair his mind had already been in after stabbing his own heart and pouring destructive energies into it for several hours, Ryu was clinging onto a last bit of rope with the barest tips of his fingers. Ryu no longer felt he was breathing in air. It was as though the skies had ripped open to pour pools of lava directly down his throat. Every heaving attempt to replenish his oxygen scorched his lungs and chest. It was so painful that Ryu could almost ignore the gaping, throbbing wound above and within his heart. The branches of the forest around him, vicious, snapped against his body. Even the faintest dust particles became heated blade edges, piercing through his body with impunity. A pulse-opening realm youth simply wasn't meant to experience such speeds. Headmaster Leopold continuously covered double the land Ryu did, slowly closing the gap between them. Somehow, his instincts were forcing him into an anxious state once more. For all his power, no matter how he racked his mind, he couldn't figure out just what was making him so uncomfortable. Fourth Prince, is there a need to continue this farce? Headmaster Leopold called out. Ryu's eyes contracted into pinholes when this voice entered his ears. All this time, Leopold might have been aware of who he was chasing, but it wasn't until now that Ryu knew who his opponent was. Once he processed this information, Ryu's eyes flashed with a keen light. You just made a massive mistake giving me this piece of information. Ryu sneered. He didn't know why Leopold had blown his comm cover. Maybe he was just losing his patience and getting annoyed. Or maybe he was getting worried about what Ryu was planning. But either way, it didn't matter. When dealing with intelligent people, the less information you give them, the better chance you had for success. Since Leopold didn't understand this fundamental rule, Ryu didn't mind teaching him. Is this Leopold the same Leopold? Ryu's mind quickly thought. He found these distracting thoughts couldn't have come at a better time. It doesn't matter, since he called me Fourth Prince. This means that, at the very least, he was the same Leopold that moderated the coronation games. That truth is all I need for this to work. Suddenly, the roar of a beast caught Ryu completely off guard. At this moment, how could he spare stamina toward third perspective? He was completely relying on eyesight alone. Up to now, he hadn't seen anything out of place. Ryu's eyes narrowed. He silently began to communicate with his bone structure. However, he could only panic when he realized he couldn't find the link he was looking for. Ryu laughed bitterly. With the state he was in, how could he expect his body to react exactly like he wanted it to? Ryu's ancestral-grade ice jade crystal bone structure was beloved by nature. Its perfect symmetry was blessed by the heavens, and as such, it had a calming effect on beasts. This was the ability Ryu relied upon to tame his obscured sky falcon. Ryu wanted to use this ability to hopefully get whatever beast was coming to ignore him, or at least let him run out of its territory. But his tank was running on empty. The roar shook the forest. Soon, the sound of crashing trees was replaced by the actual visual of them falling one after another. A looming beast appeared in the distance, bounding toward Ryu. Damn it, Ryu roared in his mind. If it was up to him, he'd scream it at the top of his lungs. But even in his anger, He couldn't spare the energy to do such a thing. Ryu was well aware that the moment his legs paused for even a moment, his body would collapse. The beast was a massive blue-furred ape. It stood at over 5 meters tall, and its trunk-like arms dwarfed even the ancient trees of this forest. The worst part was that Ryu's sharp sight immediately trained on 2 budding lumps of flesh, a small relative distance beneath its armpits. This ape was actually only a step away from evolving and becoming 4-armed. Ryu didn't know a lot about beasts on the mortal plane, but he did know that this evolution was something only possible within the divine vessel realm, because this was the stage in which cultivators could begin to unlock the true and hidden abilities of their bloodlines. This was at least a 5th-order beast. No matter how much Ryu wanted to find a path to victory, what could he do? As a 5th-order beast, its speed was near a match for Ryu. This also didn't account for the fact that Ryu might have speed, but he definitely didn't have any agility. If he attempted to change directions quickly at this speed, his bones would shatter and his tendons would tear. If that happened, he would be finished. The several hundred-meter distance between Ryu and the ape seemed to close in an instant. Ryu was prepared to calmly accept his death. His only regret was that he couldn't fulfill his promise to Alina. At the very least, he wouldn't feel shame. He had truly given it his everything. An eerie calm overtook him as he faced the enraged roar of the ape. It seemed as though he'd be swallowed whole in another instant. It was in that moment that a hidden cool kai wafted from his eyes once more. That eerie calm became steadier than a serene lake. Ryu's eyes flashed as he looked down at an inconspicuous black glove over his right hand. Suddenly, he understood something. Essence suddenly rushed out from the glove of order, and his unresponsive bone structure began to shimmer like a precious gem. Ryu's bones and skin began to glow a comforting, shimmering light. In the next moment, his veins and arteries followed suit. Given the amount of light coming off of him, it should have been irritating to the eyes, but somehow, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. One had to understand that, although Ryu's ice jade crystal body was known as a bone structure, bones were inextricably linked to the circulatory system. There was no shortage of stories where geniuses were born with domineering bloodlines, but couldn't support its potential with their weak bone structure. Why was it that Ryu could have 4 seemingly opposing bloodlines in a single body? It was precisely because his bone structure was known for its perfect balance. There was likely not a single other bone structure in existence that could accomplish what Ryu's had. The moment his bones reacted, so too did his blood vessels. An instant later, a calming wave wafted from Ryu's body. Not only did it exude essence, there was a natural, intoxicating aroma that stopped the ape in its tracks. It was as though it could fall asleep at any moment under the influence of Ryu's constitution. Ryu's legs didn't pause for even a moment. He burst through the legs of the ape, slightly ducking to pass by with ease. He was well aware that such a state would last for long, so he didn't even bother to look back. He simply kept pushing himself. Headmaster Leopold frowned. He wanted to release resonating sense once more, but he hesitated. More than half of his spiritual chi had gone up in smoke due to the technique after using it only twice. He had to be careful with his uses, or else wouldn't it be too much of a joke if he was too tired to deal with a mere pulse-opening realm youth. By the time the ape awoke from its daze, Ryu was already gone. It only lasted from 2 or 3 seconds, but that was enough for Ryu to cover over a kilometer with ease. With the help of the dense trees, he was able to escape the ape's immediate notice. Ryu spared another glance toward the glove of order. Before, it had shot up his arm and covered his shoulders. In addition, it had formed a gauntlet-like black armor from the tips of his fingers to his wrist. But after that maneuver, it reverted back to its previous bland appearance. Just what kind of treasure is this? Ryu mumbled to himself. A treasure capable of manipulating the highest form of energy, essence, was definitely no normal treasure. In fact, Ryu didn't believe even the shrine plane had a treasure capable of doing such a thing. Well, it did, but it was limited to treasures like the northern heavenly wind and the origin flame. All Ryu understood about the glove of order was that it grew in strength based on his comprehension of the natural order. It only evolved so much after it absorbed his comprehension of halberd, glaive, and spear chi. In addition, it had the ability to perfectly fuse your comprehensions into an arrow. It might sound simple to say fuse, but it needed to be understood how practically impossible that was. Ryu had trouble just using two of the same weapons at once. He hadn't even considered the idea of using two different weapons at once, let alone three. Many cultivators could use two natural orders at the same time, but only a handful could perfectly fuse them to be used as one. Yet the glove of order did it with absolute ease. What was the secret of the glove? How did its absorption of essence correlate with its ability to fuse natural orders? Also, had it become much weaker after helping Ryu escape certain death? At the very least, the last question had a resounding yes for its answer. Ryu faintly understood that, unless his comprehension took another leap forward, the glove wouldn't react to him again. Luckily, he also faintly understood that this would affect his ability to form arrows. Ryu believed that this instinct was definitely tied to his heavenly pupils. Only it could provide him with such insight. However, that weakening didn't come without benefits. Not only had Ryu escaped death, but his body was pumping with the purest energy in existence, even better than spiritual chi. His natural healing factor accelerated, and his mental realm was awash with a calming kai that soothed its aching caused by the constant shattering the immortal sakura petals. Though Ryu's body was still in a terrible state, at the very least, he wasn't at death's door just yet. He had taken a single step back. Ryu felt that his bone structure had slightly awakened to its true abilities. It was only a small creak in a large door, but there was definitely an improvement. Much like bloodlines, the true abilities of bone structures weren't meant to be tapped into until the divine vessel realm. The fact Ryu had faintly touched upon something was completely unprecedented. Unfortunately, Ryu didn't have much more time to think about it now. The natural fragrance he gave off continued, resulting the surrounding beasts completely ignoring his presence. However, the same couldn't be said for Headmaster Leopold. When he crossed the territory of the blue-furred ape, he was forced into a battle. For him, a fifth-order beast was below him in strength, but one had to remember that beasts were often stronger than their human counterparts. Though the ape was only the equivalent of a divine vessel realm expert, it still took Leopold several minutes to kill it, giving Ryu valuable time. History repeated itself. As they entered deeper and deeper into the forest, Leopold began to fight more and more battles, slowing him down further. Eventually, he began to take detours around beast territories by making use of his spiritual sense. He was a mental realm cultivator. His fighting prowess simply wasn't very high. Mental realm cultivators were extraordinarily weak without strong legacies backing them, and Leopold's legacy happened to be in Ryu's hands. That's it. Ryu's cold, silver eyes flashed with a ray of unconcealed excitement. He could see it, the immortal path. The immortal path on every plane was the exact same. It was located at the base of a massive and majestic rock structure. Those on the lower planes had no idea what this endless rock was, but Ryu knew it all too well. It was none other than Shrine Mountain. That was right, Shrine Mountain was a structure that spanned all 6, now likely 7 planes. No one understood just how it worked. Sometimes, the mountain would appear on the edge of planes just like it did on this higher mortal plane, or, at other times, it would appear directly in the middle like it did for Ryu's shrine plane. Either way, no matter what, upon passing its test, one would be teleported to the furthest location from the mountain. The Shrine Mountain appeared in the absolute center of the immortal planes, but always appeared on the edge of mortal planes. One Ryu completed the trial. He would be teleported to the very edge of the pedestal plane, something Granny Miriam called the outer ring. However, Ryu had no intention of doing that. He didn't want to be constantly looking over his shoulder for the day Headmaster Leopold would find him. No, This immortal path would be Leopold's deathbed. Ryu burst forward, without an ounce of hesitation. He crossed into the inconspicuous at the base of Shrine Mountain before his body convulsed, slowing down his speed drastically, as though his body was waiting for this very moment to attack him. A wave of pain tore through Ryu, causing a roar of anguish to escape his lips. His bones fractured, and his tense muscles tore, shredding one after another without thought of stopping. Maybe the only saving grace was that Ryu's upper body was left alone. But that was only in a relative sense, considering the ghastly chest wound that still adorned his heart and ribs. Ryu suddenly felt his body go cold. A deep shivering erupted from his core, taking over without regard for his own feelings. It only took Ryu a moment to understand what was happening because he had experienced it before. It was death. His body had gone through too much in the last few hours. The moment he relaxed even a moment, that tenseness that was keeping his together shattered. Ryu fell to the ground, his lips bluing as he gripped his fist over his chest. The cave around him was dark. In the far distance, Ryu could see a faint light that was likely the true entrance of the immortal path, but even the effort of looking was too much for him. He immediately regretted slowing down. Why had he done it if he had just kept going? Ryu laughed at himself. What a joke. His body was on its final legs to begin with. In all likelihood, he wouldn't have made it whether he relaxed or not. Gritting his teeth, Ryu began to crawl. If he had even a single ounce of strength left, he wouldn't let it go waste. If fate wanted to kill him, then he'd only allow it to do so when he truly had nothing remaining. Fate would have to take his life from him. He would no longer simply hand it over. As Ryu crawled toward what seemed like an impossibly far-away goal, Headmaster Leopold sprinted at his fastest speed. He had his own worries as well, though they were decidedly less existential than Ryu's. He knew well that upon completion of the immortal path, Shrine Mountain would teleport its trial taker the furthest points from itself. On the mortal planes, that made things easy since Shrine Mountain was located upon their edges. However, for the immortal planes, this meant that there were a near, if not infinite, number of locations Ryu could appear precisely because, for them, Shrine Mountain was located in its very center. If he allowed Ryu to complete the immortal path, it would be an impossible task to find him. It was known by everyone that immortal planes were easily 10 times larger than mortal planes, and that was a conservative estimate. Considering the size of the outer ring, how could Leopold be expected to find him? The worst part was that Leopold's strength was garbage on the immortal plane. What if Ryu used his talent to gain some substantial backing? By that point, Leopold would be the one who had to hide. Ryu continuously stabbed his daggers into the cave's floor, pulling himself forward inch by inch. Leopold probably thought that he'd be able to catch Ryu, as he was struggling against the pressure of the immortal path. This was Ryu's ray of hope. He had to make it. His legs were absolutely useless, not to mention the fact his bones were fractured in too many places to count. Even if they weren't, the muscles he needed to use them were torn beyond recognition. If Ryu's legs weren't covered by black fabrics, they would shine a disgusting purple, blue and green color. Ryu suspected that his legs had long been in this sort of condition, but adrenaline and his willpower pushed him through it. However, he had never expected for it to be this bad. This level of self-mutilation was enough to cause a wave of disgust in anyone's heart. Pain racked Ryu's body as he was forced to drag his injured chest along the hard ground. He had no idea that Headmaster Leopold had already set his sights on the large rock face of Shrine Mountain. The more than 10 meters that remained between him and the orb of light before him seemed like the distance between the earth and the heavens. Ryu's tenacity shone through, however it wasn't enough. Headmaster Leopold made his way to the cave entrance, gasping for breath. But when he saw Ryu's unsightly appearance, a thunderous laughter erupted from his wrinkled lips. "Tusk, to put you in such a state, I can imagine that technique you use to explosively increase your speed is definitely taking its toll. HM." The weight on Leopold's chest dropped, leaving a pep in his step he hadn't experienced for several hundred years. Today was definitely a good day. For him, that is. Ryu continued to claw forward as though he hadn't heard a single word. The trail of blood left behind sent a shiver through Leopold's spine, but he quickly shook it off. He might be surprised by Ryu's will to live, but what did that matter? Everything was meaningless in the face of absolute power. Is there a need to be like this? Leopold casually walked to Ryu's side, lifting his head from the cave floor by his dirtied white hair. In that instant, Leopold was shocked by the cold emitting from Ryu's body. As an experienced person, he immediately sensed what it was, the breath of death. This young man wasn't more than a few minutes from losing his life. Leopold immediately gave up all thoughts of threatening Ryu's life. What was the point? He let Ryu's head drop. The dull thump of what sounded like nothing more than a dead body resounded through the cave. Still, somehow, Ryu's arms never stopped. He continued to crawl as though he was mindless. Leopold frowned. Checking Ryu's hand, he looked for his spatial ring, but he shockingly found nothing. Suddenly, a bad premonition overcame him. In a rage, he kicked Ryu's body, sending him slamming against the side of the cave with a reverberating boom. Blood flew from Ryu's lips as he slid down the cave wall. He was nothing more than a limp doll. "Where is it?" Leopold roared. Ryu coughed, a sneer coating his blue lips. "It's in my inner space. Why don't you kill me and find out if you can get it or not? Or is the Grand Headmaster Leopold as useless as his two disciples? You!" Leopold trembled with rage. His hand descended, slapping Ryu across the face and sending him flying. Suddenly, Ryu laughed. "It was a 50-50 chance, but you still did me a favor. Thank you." Leopold immediately realized his mistake, but it was too late. Ryu's body flew into the immortal path. Headmaster Leopold's heart seized. He immediately realized his mistake. If Ryu hadn't known who he was from the very beginning, would he have been able to goad him into anger so quickly? Even further, would Ryu be so confident that he wouldn't kill him? The answer to both were resounding nos. Ryu knew that Leopold had disappointing disciples, only because he knew who Leopold was. Ryu also knew that Leopold wouldn't strike hard enough to kill him, because he already guessed that Leopold had some insight into the fact he had a pair of heavenly pupils, due to the battle against the ice-eyed bear. He even knew something as seemingly useless as Leopold's dominant hand. Had Leopold not been so cocky, Ryu wouldn't have been bold enough to gamble with his life in such a way. Damn it! Leopold's foot struck the ground as he surged toward the immortal path. "It doesn't matter. Do you think the immortal path is a joke? Even I must take it seriously." What Leopold was worried about wasn't that Ryu had a trap waiting for him, but rather that Ryu would immediately die after entering the path. Unfortunately for him, he was wrong, very wrong. Leopold grunted as he stepped into the orb of light. The immortal path blinded him for an instant before its beauty was revealed to him. The best words to describe the immortal path were staircase to heaven. A path of golden stairs seemed to rise to infinity. They weren't very wide, maybe only about 2 meters across, leaving a seemingly endless abyss below them. That said, this abyss was a gentle white light, with a slight golden hue instead of an unknown void of black. Still, the path didn't allow one to fall off of it. There were only two options: to reach the top or be crushed under the pressure and die without a corpse. There was no going back. Leopold almost fell to his knees the moment he landed upon the first step. The immortal path didn't test your strength, it tested your potential. As an old man who had already maxed out his limit, his only chance at greater heights was the legacy in Ryu's hands. So how could the path treat him well? Still, though strength wasn't the main focus of the path, it still allowed some leeway, giving Leopold the opportunity to rely on his cultivation to struggle upward and stand tall. However, what he saw was a sight he'd never forget in his entire life. Ryu sat above him. His legs were in no condition to help him stand, and he seemed like an arrow at the end of its flight, but he still firmly held onto a black long bow, pulling the string with all his remaining might. A blazing golden flame lit around Ryu. It only took a moment for the experienced Leopold to understand that these golden flames weren't true flames, but rather the rapid coalescing of essence. Leopold's mind trembled. The densest cores of essence in existence were without a doubt the immortal paths. It wasn't just that it was abundant in its atmosphere, but rather that its entire space was constructed with essence, even the stairs beneath their feet. Headmaster Leopold's eyes shifted from the raging arrow, still forming to land on Ryu's right hand. The glove of order had morphed again, shedding its black exterior to come alight with a golden blaze. It surged up Ryu's arm once more, covering the whole of his shoulder in a brilliant sheen. This time, the gorgeous armor didn't stop at his wrist, but shot up to his forearm. Even as Ryu's arm trembled, the power of the arrow grew stronger and stronger. Leopold felt fear. He wanted to run. He realized at this moment that he was no longer the hunter in this situation. The moment he allowed Ryu to enter the immortal path, it was over. He couldn't even summon his strength because every fiber of his being was being used to stand. "Please, please, don't kill me." Leopold trembled. Here, take it." He pulled his spatial ring out and threw it at Ryu. "I swear I won't move from this place until you complete the path. You'll be teleported to a random place, and I'd never dare to come find you after that." By the time Leopold realized that this overwhelming fear wasn't just due to worry for his life, but also because of Ryu's piercing gaze, it was already too late. Ryu didn't even hesitate to let the arrow loose. He didn't have any remorse for a man who didn't hesitate to wipe out an entire sect of people. As for why Leopold did this, Ryu had no idea. Maybe he wanted to agitate things, or maybe he was pissed off that the elders of the Natural Order sect didn't have what he was looking for. By the time the blinding light the arrow emitted faded, Ryu realized that Leopold's body was nowhere to be seen. At that moment, he understood what happened. Leopold couldn't control his cowardice in the end, so he attempted to retreat. Unfortunately, on the immortal path you could only go forward. The moment he failed to control himself, the path killed him. How foolish! Ryu sneered. His original plan was just to force Leopold to take a step back. He didn't have any illusions of killing a connecting heaven realm expert, even with the help of the excessive essence floating around him. But who would have known that Leopold would lack backbone to this extent? Suddenly, a resounding crack entered Ryu's ears. Looking down at his bow, he sighed as it crumbled to dust. He felt it was unfortunate, but exchanging this bow for his life was worth it. The bluing of Ryu's lips retreated. The gold of his glove of order surged into his body, stabilizing his condition. Soon he fell into a deep sleep as his glove receded to its inconspicuous black color. Months ticked by. No one would ever expect that someone would ever dare to sleep on the immortal path. It was precisely this reason why Ryu knew it was the safest. What were the odds that someone would attempt this trial and find him? Incredibly low considering the level of the higher mortal plane. As for those descending, they had a completely different process, so they wouldn't cross Ryu's path. Essence slowly nourished Ryu's body. The immortal path, much like any other trial, was also an opportunity to push past your own limits. Unfortunately, considering Ryu's talent, the path was limited in its ability to help him. This was why it didn't even bother to pressure him. However, there was one thing it could do for Ryu besides supplementing his healing. Unlike his body and chi realm talent, Ryu's mental realm talent was lacking. The immortal path couldn't fix this, but it could reward him for the struggle his mind had undergone. Every time the immortal Sakura petals shattered, Ryu's mind withstood terrible impacts. If one were to peer into his mental realm now, one would find a disturbing dark space, filled with cracks. It seemed as though its 30-meter-wide space might collapse at any moment. Once this happened, Ryu would die without a doubt. Luckily, this was when the essence made its presence known. Not only was Ryu's mental realm slowly healing, it was also steadily growing, inch by inch. Months ticked by. It wasn't until the 4th month that Ryu's body looked less like a corpse and more like a living being. and not until the sixth that Ryu's conscience finally began to flicker awake. By now, Ryu was 18 years old, and it had been almost 4 years since his memories awoke. Ryu's eyes opened with a flash. He found himself laying on a familiar set of golden stairs, and could only count himself lucky that he didn't roll backward in his sleep. What a joke that would have been! For him to survive the chase of a connecting heaven realm expert, but die only because he rolled too far. The first thing Ryu did was check his body. He found that his wounds had still not fully healed, even after half a year. Something he had to admit greatly frightened him. It definitely wasn't as bad as it once was, but Ryu knew that if he were to fight now, he would still only have 20% of his prowess at most. Ryu sighed. He shouldn't be too surprised. Even with his cultivation, his body was nowhere near that of immortals who could survive even with large portions of their vital organs cut away. Ryu could only be considered marginally above mortal status. So, something like an open heart wound couldn't just be wished away, nor could devastating muscle tears and bone fractures. There was one saving grace, though. The heavens provided a sort of reset whenever one broke into a new realm. This shedding of sorts was the true dividing line between cultivation realms. As long as Ryu officially entered the chi refinement realm, these hidden injuries should disappear. Of course, there were some hidden injuries that even crossing into a new realm couldn't shed. But these sorts of physical injuries shouldn't be too much of a problem. Now, the only question was how to break through. Ryu definitely couldn't step onto the pedestal plane while so injured. However, Ryu also had no knowledge about cultivation past the pulse opening realm, other than superficial understandings, that is. Suddenly, Ryu remembered something, and a sneer coated his haggard features. His body was aching too much for sudden movement, but he didn't need to move to send his mind into his own inner space. It only took a moment for the visual of the crystalline jade to appear in Ryu's mind, and for him to enter it. Thanks to the abilities of his heavenly pupils, he didn't need to take it out and gather up spatial kai to make use of this treasure. Up to now, Ryu had collected the second, third, and fourth floors of Zoo Palace. This allowed him access to divisions of core texts, natural order, and battle spirit. However, after taking the final and fourth piece, he gained access to the first floor's cultivation division. After entering the crystalline jade, Ryu didn't even attempt to go to Zoo Library. Though it was true the most valuable techniques of the Zoo clan were located there, it was also true that Ryu could lose his life to the Zoo ancestors as well. Until he had certain countermeasures, he wouldn't enter, even though he was certain that the four of them would be very willing to negotiate with him considering the circumstances. Ryu smiled as he looked at the completed first floor. So many years of hardship and almost losing his life was truly worth it. The first floor was also a library, though much smaller than the one located on the second floor. That said, what was stored here wasn't any less important, and it was exactly what Ryu was looking for. A single bookshelf of cultivation techniques sat adorned in precious gems to one side, while most of the rest of the room was filled with statues that were difficult to look at. These statues came in all shapes. One was of a blazing sun, another was of a valiant man, another was of a majestic palace, and yet another was of a reflective moon. Ryu could tell that these statues were actually what the Zoo clan would find most important. They were difficult to look at not because they were ugly, but because they were true visualization techniques. Meditating and reflecting on them would greatly improve Ryu's mental realm. To think there were so many. I wonder what the secret behind this crystalline jade is. It's clear that it's only my mind entering. So why is it that these things seem so tangible? More poignantly, how did the Zoo ancestors bring their incarnation jades into a place that should be a mental projection? Even with his intelligence, Ryu couldn't figure it out. He could only guess that the Zoo clan had a heaven-defying technique, capable of making the corporeal illusory, and vice versa. If this was true, the potential applications made Ryu's heart palpitate. Shaking his head, Ryu focused on the singular bookcase that seemed made of precious white jade. Though it was only one bookcase, it was filled with memory jades, several hundred by Ryu's estimate due to how little the space they took up was. With a simple read-through of a few, Ryu was immediately overwhelmed. It took him a moment to understand that the cultivation techniques he began with were far above his level. In a cultivator's lifespan, they could cultivate 3 types of kiss. The first is one Ryu controlled now, known as mortal chi. Once one reaches an appropriate level, mortal chi will undergo a qualitative change to become immortal chi. Finally, immortal chi will evolve one final time to become cosmic chi. The difference between these kiss was akin to heaven and earth. A single strand of immortal chi could crush 10,000 strands of mortal chi without much effort at all. But the important part was that these types of kai required different types of cultivation techniques. Mortal techniques, immortal techniques, and cosmic techniques. These, of course, all solely referred to chi realm cultivation. Ryu had made a mistake by accidentally sending his mind into the memory jades of a few immortal techniques, and was immediately overwhelmed. After correcting himself, he found the appropriate section for mortal techniques and began to read them one by one. Slowly, Ryu began to understand. These techniques were where the importance of opening your pulses shone through. Mortal techniques didn't follow the same common, black, earth, etc. grade system battle techniques did. Instead, they had 6 division from 1 star, being the weakest, to 6 star being the strongest. These rankings denoted just how many pulses a technique could make efficient use of. 1 star could only make use of 1 pulse, while 6 star could make use of all 6 chi pulses. This decided not only the speed of cultivation, but also the purity of one's kai. The chi refinement realm was all about meridian strengthening and energy tempering. While the awakening realm had stages known as rites, this realm was known for its revolutions. The more revolutions one completed, the cleaner and thicker one's kai would become. Obviously, this was much easier with a 6-star technique than a 1-star, and luckily, the Zhu clan, at least for the low-level mortal techniques, didn't have anything lower than 5 stars. The only question was just what type of technique was best suited for Ryu. Though there were only 3 main divisions of kai in the martial world, the sub-levels hidden within were to the point of being infinite in quantity. What could be denoted as mortal, immortal, or cosmic chi was actually just a subgroup of energies that represented a certain quality. This was why Ryu was having a bit of an issue choosing his path. Without a master, he could only rely on his own intuition. When choosing a chi technique, it was of the utmost importance to take into account one's meridians. Ryu was born with chaotic silk meridians, a substance known for being incredibly light, while simultaneously being the 3rd strongest material in existence. An ancestral grade meridian system like Ryu's gave him near infinite paths to choose from. It was no wonder he was struggling. At the same time, one must also consider your affinities. Some types of chi techniques worked better for others simply due to special talents they might have. For example, those with high ice affinities should tend toward yin-type chi techniques, while those with high fire affinities should tend toward yang. This was where Ryu ran into yet another issue. Due to his bloodlines, he had exceptionally high affinities for fire, ice, and lightning. At the same time, his bone structure was incredibly balanced, despite being known as Ice Jade Crystal Body. Actually, the true name of Ryu's bone structure was lost in translation. As far as Ryu was aware, ice in this context was actually meant to refer to purity, not cold. If it was simply about cold, Opus Kingdom's low temperatures would have never bothered Ryu at all. Ryu flipped through techniques one by one. For now, he ignored the body realm cultivation techniques. He had to focus on healing himself first. Practicing body cultivation might have the opposite result. Rising Sun Chi. Its speed was the quickest during early mornings. There was an additional speed boost to cultivation the closer to the sun one was, and also the hotter their environment was. Qi from this technique would raise affinity for yang-type techniques and also facilitate comprehending yang-type natural orders as well, especially fire-related ones. Swift Yin Qi. This cultivation technique was known for producing exceptionally light Kai. It was great for agility-type cultivators, and especially virgin women. Cultivation was quick within realms, but one suffered when crossing large barriers due to a struggle in building up momentum. Obviously, it was difficult to attack new realms when your Kai was lighter than air. Tribulation 9 clouds. This technique intrigued Ryu despite the fact it was practically suicide. Tribulations in the martial world were incredibly rare, or rather, tribulation clouds were. Cultivators themselves faced many internal tribulations like the awakening realm's rites, or the spiritual severing realm's severings, or the path extinction realm's extinctions. However, cultivators were rarely punished by tribulation clouds. Cultivation alone was punishment enough. However, this didn't mean that tribulation clouds didn't exist. Still, they usually only appeared for the creation of heavenly weapons or pills. There were also special danger zones that had perpetual tribulation clouds hanging over them due to some mighty event that took place in the past. Ryu also believed he heard a rumor that it was necessary to survive a 9-cloud tribulation in order to become a sky god and have your inheritance passed down by the heavens. This was all to say that to practice this tribulation, 9 clouds chi technique was asking for death. If one stepped onto this path for mortal chi, you'd have to follow suit with immortal and cosmic chi as well. It worked by converting lightning strikes into one's own Kai. This gave a cultivator unprecedented explosive power and also tempered the body and mind simultaneously. This sort of technique would only be chosen by those who were lacking in talent and hoped to use near-death experiences to improve their constitution. Obviously, Ryu had no need to do such a thing. In addition, having to rely on the incredibly rare tribulation cloud would only slow down his cultivation. Ryu discarded it along with the rest, passing through without hesitation. It wasn't that he didn't realize that this technique was amazing. It was just that all of these techniques were amazing. Even the worst of them were 5 stars. After a while, Ryu understood what he should be looking for. Thanks to his ice jade crystal body, Ryu didn't need to find techniques that focused on cultivation speed. The benefit of his bone structure would handle that for him. Instead, Ryu decided to make full use of his chaotic silk meridians. Since they were the 3rd hardest material in existence, why not push them to their absolute limit? Ryu wanted a technique that focused on Kai purity and density. He wanted something that compressed his Kai past the limits a normal cultivator could withstand. Only this way would he be able to make the best use of his chaotic silk. Ryu was well aware that the revolutions of the chi refinement realm already served this purpose. However, he wanted to take it to the extreme. Although his spiritual foundation was far larger than an average cultivator, those of Ryu's cultivation realm could only make use of the chi fumes that emitted from it. These so-called chi fumes were a primer to mortal chi. It was incredibly light and was used up quickly. It was only because his spiritual foundation was so large and emitted excessive amounts of chi fumes that he was able to draw chi lines despite not being in the chi refinement realm yet. Simply put, Ryu wouldn't be able to tap into the true potential of his spiritual foundation until he entered the world sea realm. Such a matter was so far away that Ryu didn't even want to think about it. Eventually, Ryu found 3 techniques that met his requirements. 6 realm opening. This technique converted your chi pulses into miniature dantians. Though they wouldn't contain a spiritual foundation, they would contain an excess amount of Kai that could be tapped into at will. Since pulses were about 2 to 3 times larger than normal meridians, only they could withstand such a thing. But this was only relative. Only reinforcement-type meridians like Ryu's could use this technique without crippling themselves. Abyssal Vortex Chi. This technique was also incredibly masochistic. The body had numerous nodes known as meridians. This technique used those nodes as centers to form what its creator called abyssal vortexes. These vortexes were incredibly concentrated cyclones of Kai that rotated within every node. By taking this approach, one could hold several times more Kai than usual. Revolution's amplifier. This final technique multiplied the effectiveness of revolutions by several folds. Usually, doing this might result in premature ascension to the spiritual severing realm. But this technique provided a systematic method of avoiding this issue. In Ryu's estimation, it was the most valuable of the three for this very reason alone. It was difficult to choose. All of them were 6 stars and each had a complete set of immortal and cosmic technique successors. So, Ryu had another maddening thought. What if he didn't choose? It might sound insane at first to use 3 chi techniques at once, but the more Ryu thought about it, the more feasible it became. The first reason he thought this might be possible was because all 3 of these techniques were known to be neutral chi techniques. This meant that the Kai absorbed didn't have any particular affinity or leaning. Knowing it had this shortcoming, those 3 techniques suggested that its user pair its use with techniques that did have this sort of leaning. This was what lit a light bulb for Ryu. He suddenly understood that it wasn't impossible to use multiple chi techniques at once as long as they didn't interfere with one another. For example, using a yin and yang type technique was almost surely suicide, but using a neutral type technique alongside with that had a leaning would be just fine. From what Ryu could see, one technique focused on the chi pulses, another focused on meridian nodes, and the final focused on breaking the limit on chi refinement realm revolutions. From a surface inspection, they didn't seem to overlap with one another, and since they were all neutral types, that was also yet another worry that didn't have to be considered. Of course, there was one other thing to consider, and that was the slowing of cultivation. If Ryu used these 3 techniques, he would be 3 times slower in the best-case scenario, but more likely far worse. However, Ryu decided not to worry about it. While it was true that he wanted to maximize his cultivation speed in order to save his family, he also understood that if he was too fast, he wouldn't become strong enough to do anything. What using these 3 techniques at once guaranteed him was an unmatched foundation. Much like the pulse opening realm, the chi refinement realm was divided into 4 stages: lower, middle, higher, and peak. On this higher mortal plane, each one of these stages was divided among 4 chi pulses. This was because those of the higher mortal plane were unaware of the fact that there were 6 chi pulses and not just 4. This was one of the main reasons why it was far easier for Ryu to jump cultivation stages, to battle those who should be far stronger than him. The chi refinement realm was similar. Its stages were divided by the number of completed revolutions. These revolutions would be dictated by the number of pulses one had opened, in addition to the quality of one's cultivation technique. Even if you had 4 open chi pulses, it was useless if you were only using a 2-star chi technique. Each pulse allowed 2 revolutions. This made for 12 total revolutions. In addition to these 12, there was one final great circle revolution. Once this final revolution was completed, one would be considered half-step into spiritual severing. It was only these that one's first severing could begin. Obviously, due to their own limitations, the higher mortal plane only had a max of 9 total revolutions. Ryu, however, thanks to the fact he now had 6-star techniques, could complete all 13 possible revolutions. Still, this didn't take into consideration the ability's revolutions amplifier. With its help, every chi pulse could complete 3 revolutions instead of just 2. In addition, it allowed one could complete 2 great circle revolutions instead of just 1. One can imagine the possible disparity. Even the best and most supported geniuses would only be able to complete 13 revolutions. Even if they had revolutions amplifier, they would need to also have Ryu's chaotic silk meridians, or something similar to even think of surviving its use. Yet, Ryu could complete an enormous 7 more revolutions than those of his cultivation realm. This 7 total might seem arbitrary and even somewhat small, but one had to first consider that every completed revolution resulted in an exponential increase in quality. The purer your Kai was, the more you could store and the stronger your attacks would become thanks to the increased density. In addition, Purer energy directly allowed one to complete more severings during the spiritual severing stage, thus resulting in a compounding advantage over multiple cultivation realms. Ryu didn't need to think about it any longer. He immediately began the process of comprehending these chi techniques. Because they were neutral, he didn't need to worry about any elaborate absorption prowess. All he needed was a relatively dense meditation space. Luckily, he was currently in one of the best available locations in existence, the immortal path. Without much surprise, Ryu began with Revolution's amplifier. His first task was to convert his own chi fumes into mortal chi. As such, it was important to begin with this technique first, or else he wouldn't gain the extra possible revolutions. Once all of one's chi fumes evolved into mortal chi, there was no need to ever worry about forming chi fumes again. Any that wafted from one's spiritual foundation would immediately be catalyzed into mortal chi. This sort of process was incomparably smooth for Ryu. If it wasn't for his aching body, it would have been even easier. Luckily, his meridians were nigh indestructible, so his injuries didn't directly influence his cultivation. The moment Ryu began cultivating in earnest was the moment his ancestral great circle truly shined. Cultivation was broken into two important facets: breathing and circulation. Qi is absorbed from the mouth and nose, which act as gateways. Then this Qi is circulated along certain paths within the meridians. The bodies of living creatures contain the most complex formations in existence, and many staple formations and arrays that exist today were created from examining them. What the circulation facet did was make use of these formations to elicit wanted responses. However, Ryu was on a completely different level. His ice jade crystal body could be broken down to four important abilities: accelerated healing, friend of nature and beasts, absolute balance, and, maybe most importantly now, ungodly cultivation speed. While others could only absorb Kai through the nostrils and lips, every pore of Ryu's body was capable of this feat. He could breathe with his very skin. As a result, his surface area for chi absorption reached an unprecedented height. Ryu hadn't had the opportunity to use this ability during the awakening and pulse opening realm, since neither required active chi absorption. But now, everything was different. It wasn't long before Ryu understood that he had vastly underestimated his own speed. So what if he was 3 times slower or even more? His starting point was so much higher than anyone else's that this worry seemed like a joke. His body glowed with a gentle, pulsing light that followed the pattern of his breaths. It should have taken several hours for him to compress his chi fumes into mortal chi, but the faint wisps that patrolled his meridians were compressed into a white and thick cloudy gas in less than 10 minutes. By the half-an-hour mark, Ryu was already prepared to begin his first revolution. Once this step was completed, Ryu would finally enter the chi refinement realm. The Kai that Ryu breathed into his body was incredibly pure. If it wasn't already enough that the immortal path was innately blemishless, even if it wasn't, his ice jade crystal bone structure wouldn't allow impurities to last very long. Due to this, Ryu didn't have to spend much time, if any at all, cleansing the energy he inhaled. If one could see the inside of Ryu's meridians, they'd be absolute shocked. They'd assume he was an individual who had completed at least 2 revolutions already, when the reality was that he had yet to complete even one. This was the difference between those with talent and those without. Ryu worked quickly. After converting all of his chi fumes into a sort of primer energy for mortal chi, he begun circulating Revolution's amplifier in earnest. The route was incredibly complex. Even Ryu felt like his head was spinning, so he took the first cycle incredibly slowly, etching the pattern into his mind. The main difference between 1-star and 6-star techniques was the complexity of their circulations. 1-star techniques can only make use of a single chi pulse, and as such, their circulation pattern is appropriately simple. However, 6-star techniques must cycle through all 6 chi pulses, thus meaning that they must be appropriately complex. With every chi pulse a cultivator opens, numerous novel meridian nodes and meridian pathways open as well. This was the fundamental difference between those who opened more chi pulses and those who opened less. This difference in foundation would only compound. Still, even with Ryu taking his time for his first circulation, he completed it in just half an hour. Just like this. After completing just a single circulation, the sound of a cracking barrier resounded. Ryu felt a rush of essence careen toward himself, seeping into his skin, muscles, and bones. Sixth realm opening and abyssal vortex chi. In the end, he was too inexperienced in cultivation. He hadn't even considered this problem before he began. There are only two ways to fix this: either abolish my cultivation or compensate with speed. Ryu didn't hesitate. Abolishing his own cultivation was something he was unwilling to do, namely because he was unsure if there were consequences to such an undertaking. He had just been taught a lesson about his own inexperience, so how could he make another rash decision so quickly? Sixth realm opening was definitely the easier of the two to complete with speed. Its appeal was tied in the opening of miniature danshin within the chi pulses. However, they only needed to be opened one at a time. One should be opened before entering the chi refinement realm. Then there would be one opened for each of the 4 stages of the realm. And finally, the last would be opened upon completing the Great Circle refinement. No, I should complete Abyssal Vortex Chi first. Ryu was in a race against time. He slowed the process of his breakthrough. He knew he would face backlash if he stopped it completely. From his quick calculations, he would officially become a chi refinement expert in less than 10 minutes. Normally, individuals would be ecstatic at this short time frame, but at the moment, Ryu's talent was his own hell. Abyssal Vortex Chi was a bit different from normal techniques. It didn't rely on complex circulations, relatively speaking. Instead, it formed miniature vortexes of Kai within meridian nodes. It then relied on these vortexes as centers of power. Not only did they allow one to store more energy in a more compact way, it also allowed cultivation speed to increase thanks to the unique suction abilities of the vortex. The issue was that this technique required mind-numbing amounts of Kai control. One needed to create and stabilize hundreds of vortexes. Even the lowest estimates would still have a person needing several hours to reach equilibrium. But Ryu had 10 minutes. Ryu grit his teeth. It was time to see just how reliable his chaotic silk meridians were. He didn't have the time to take it slowly like everyone else. He would be rash. He could only hope that his meridians could withstand the failures that would undoubtedly occur. With a thought, he began. The meridian's nodes he had to date totaled 333. One was born with 111. And 37 more were opened for every chi pulse that was awakened. In order to complete the foundation of this technique, Ryu needed to form 111 vortexes plus 37 more. The primer Kai within Ryu's body began to spin viciously. This was when Ryu learned the horror of what he was attempting. In the beginning, he called the circulation method of Abyssal Vortex Chi simple. From an objective point of view, it was. However, that was only if you created one vortex at a time. For the creation of every vortex, there would be a small circulation pattern around a single meridian node. After a few circulations, the vortex would be created and stabilized. You could then move on to the next circulation. However, with Ryu's time constraints, he was attempting to form multiple vortexes at once. Suddenly, those simple patterns began to overlap and complicated matters within the 3D structure of Ryu's body. Things only became worse when Ryu realized that some circulation patterns overlapped. However, Ryu soon saw that even when he failed and his energy exploded within his body, despite some painful bloating, he felt nothing else at all. This realization made him more brazen. At first, he only attempted to form 2 vortexes at once, but then it became 3, then 4. Eventually, he was creating 10 at once, and his proficiency was only growing as he familiarized himself with the chi technique. Ryu's body became a battlefield. Sometimes, blood would flow from his lips and crimson would erupt from old wounds. This couldn't be helped. Though his meridians were nigh indestructible, They were still attached to his far more vulnerable inner organs and muscles. But he continued to push him. A maddened light shone in Ryu's eyes once more. He could feel the barrier between himself and the chi refinement realm crumbling more and more with each passing moment. Sixth realm opening. Even while still circulating abyssal vortex chi, what Ryu didn't notice at this time was just how much easier it had become for him to split his mind between multiple tasks. If he had, he would have checked his mental realm to find a shocking change had occurred while he slept. Ryu roared out as he completely opened his first pulse danshin. Completion of the foundation of a second 6-star technique didn't give him any relief. In fact, now that he had set 2 perfect foundations, his breakthrough had quickened. But Ryu still smiled, because at that moment, his 148th vortex was formed. Golden tickets reached 3. Ryu's body quaked. The punishment his internal organs had taken in the last few minutes couldn't be underestimated. But Ryu had been so focused on completing his task that he had involuntarily entered the state of meditation, allowing him to ignore the pain for a moment. Until now, that was. Luckily, this pain didn't last for long. As though it was waiting for Ryu to release the reins, the cracking barrier finally shattered in earnest. Essence surged toward Ryu at greater speeds, charging into Ryu's body. Ryu felt awed. The feeling of essence circulating along so many paths of his body was numbing. The good news was that essence, as the purest energy in existence, had the ability to freely convert between all Kai forms in existence. This not only made Ryu's mortal chi incredibly pure, but it also made the process of breaking through incomparably smooth. Ryu began to cough, black blood and pieces of broken organs flying from his mouth. At first he was worried that he had put too much hope in the rebirth given during a major breakthrough, but he calmed in the next moment. These were definitely the remains of the built-up and hidden injuries within his body. The rush of pure Kai made Ryu feel that the door that opened for his bone structure had creaked open just that small bit more. Ryu knew a small bit about just what this opening door entailed thanks to his mother, so he couldn't help but smile at his progress. Finally, the final bits of Ryu's accumulated injuries healed. The fractures that riddled his legs finally sealed, and his tendons and ligaments began to reconnect. In the end, Ryu collapsed, not in fatigue but in relief. The endless pain for months on end had definitely taken its toll on his mind. So this is the consequence of breaching power I shouldn't, Ryu sighed. He hadn't expected that ignoring his own limitations to push his speed that far would have such drastic effects. His constitution was known for its healing ability, yet 6 months in a coma had hardly moved the needle. This taught Ryu a valuable lesson. The greatness of healing factors was only relative to your own strength. How could it be just as easy to heal from damage dealt by a divine vessel realm expert versus an awakening realm expert? Even if they objectively dealt the same damage, the quality of a divine vessel realm expert's strike was simply a level above. When Ryu tapped into the speed of a divine vessel realm expert, he was doing damage to himself that his body wasn't equipped to deal with. He reached a threshold he had no business being a part of. Right then, he swore that he wouldn't do something so foolish again, unless his life was on the line once more. I need to ensure that I have no hidden injuries left, or else they'll only accumulate. Ryu knew that the so-called rebirth given by a large breakthrough wasn't infallible, so he began to think of spiritual herbs that would best handle the situation. If he could find or buy a few young sprouts, with the incubator's help, he shouldn't have anything to worry about anymore. Ryu smiled lightly as he realized Leopold's spatial ring was still resting on his lap. He had been fully prepared for the immortal path to destroy everything of the old headmasters, but who would have known that he would just throw his spatial ring over as a sign of good faith? Ryu nodded in satisfaction as he looked through Leopold's ring. Though he was a weakling in the grand scheme of the pedestal plane, he was still rich by the standards of a lower chi refinement expert like Ryu. Before, Ryu only had 1,000 inferior mortal chi stones and 20 medial chi stones. But Thanks to Leopold, that number had raised significantly. Leopold had 10,000 medial mortal chi stones, 100 superior mortal chi stones, and 3 inferior immortal chi stones. Ryu didn't know much about the outer ring he would be headed to soon, but he reminded himself to not flaunt his wealth openly. He would realize soon how good a choice this was, after he learned that the outer ring still dealt heavily with gold coins. To them, chi stones were a massive luxury. Ryu didn't even think about using these chi stones for cultivation. Relying on them would not only dull his cultivation sense, but the ease with which they could be used would make his foundation unstable. He strictly set them aside as his currency. That said, if he ever found the legendary essence stones, this would be a different matter entirely. Medial chi stones were worth 100 inferior ones, and were worth 100th of superior ones. However, immortal chi stones were a massive leap forward, being worth 10,000 superior mortal chi stones each, though no one would ever exchange them this way. This was all to say that for Ryu's current purposes, Leopold's wealth was definitely not small. In fact, it was enough to make him the wealthiest individual of the outer ring before he had even stepped foot in it. Aside from these chi stones, Leopold had piles of gold coins he had likely accumulated from his years as headmaster. The Three Kingdoms Institute definitely didn't have cheap tuition fees. Unbeknownst to Ryu, they would soon come in handy, but for now he couldn't be bothered to count. What Ryu was more interested in were the cultivation resources. Leopold had the many of these, likely because he had stocked up, planning to spend years on the inferior higher mortal plane. But that suited Ryu just fine. Thanks to the Natural Order sect, Ryu had 9 total chi whispering herbs and 1 bone separating root. Since Leopold was a connecting heaven realm expert, these earth-grade spiritual herbs were of great use to him, so he had many, though he had far less bones separating root than Ryu would have liked. There were 100 chi whispering herbs and 20 bones separating roots. That said, it wasn't a large problem. Ryu still have many beast spiritual roots he had yet to cultivate with due to not having a body realm cultivation technique. Unfortunately, Ryu's cultivation was still too weak to use earth-grade spiritual herbs, since he couldn't allow them into his incubator. For now, black-grade herbs were the most useful to him, and would continue to be into the spiritual severing realm. But for obvious reasons, Leopold had none of them. Finally, Ryu glanced at the resonating sense memory jade in the corner of Leopold's ring. He realized that this technique was likely how Leopold had found him so easily. He didn't have time to learn it now, but he might consider it in the future. For now, Ryu needed to choose a mental realm and body realm cultivation technique for him. Once that was completed, he'd walk this immortal path to the end. Ryu sent his mind back into Zoo Palace and onto the familiar first floor. Unlike his chi technique choices, Ryu's scope for his mental and body techniques were fairly limited. He wanted a body technique capable of capitalizing on his flexibility and balance, not one that bulked him up. As for his mental technique, or visualization technique rather, what would be a better choice if not the immortal Sakura? The mind often took on characteristics of one's visualization technique. In fact, some who followed the mental realm discipline even believed that one's personality could be changed, depending on the technique they chose. While the immortal Sakura was, of course, an outstanding defensive technique, it could also be used as a visualization technique as well. In fact, any mental realm technique that relied on some sort of visualization could be used in this way. Ryu didn't need to think much to choose this path. Not only would he be able to cultivate his mental realm, as he did so, his comprehension of the immortal Sakura technique would deepen. In addition, as time passed, his mind would gain inherently strong defenses due to the constant visualization. This, after walking into the depths of the first floor, Ryu found, as he expected, an immortal Sakura. It wasn't just a majestic tree either. Ryu felt that this might truly be the last immortal Sakura in existence. His heart couldn't help but palpitate slightly as its golden blossom petals shimmered before his eyes. Ryu knew immediately that the visualization found deep within this forest of statues were by far the best the Zhu clan had to offer, but they were also the most dangerous. Ryu felt a splitting headache just from a short glance. In addition, the tree felt ethereal to him, as though it wasn't allowing him to see its true appearance. Immortal Sakura, he hadn't practiced these techniques at all. It was only now that Ryu understood the value of a teacher. If Asuka hadn't showed him the immortal Sakura in its simplest form, would he have grasped it so quickly? Why are there 4 others, though? There should only be 3 more ancestors, no. Ryu's eyes narrowed and he immediately put up his guard. The Zhu clan's legacy was important to him enough for him to risk his life for it. But that didn't mean he would give himself over to it free of charge. This was why he had yet to go and see the Zhu clan ancestors, even though he held all the leverage in his hands now. With the seal gone and the jade in his possession, he was their only chance at revival. However, this didn't mean he was free. If he went to see them, he would have to make a deal. If there happened to be a 5th one of them floating around that he didn't know about, they could easily weasel out of any contract he made. After reminding himself to be careful, Ryu gave the 4 vague figures one last glance. Something was telling him that he didn't need the ancestor to bestow him their techniques for him to see them. As long as his heavenly pupils progressed, nothing would be able to hide from his gaze. Not long later, Ryu began to go through the body realm techniques one by one. But as one might expect of a mental realm clan, their selection was incredibly limited. Chi cultivation was still important to a mental realm cultivator, since a powerful soul couldn't survive without a powerful enough body. But body realm cultivation ceased to be important to them after the vessel tempering realm. Mental realm cultivation was known for its small number of realms with just 6. But body realm cultivation had an even smaller number at just 4. The pulse tempering realm, Ryu's current state, the vessel tempering realm, the blood tempering realm, and finally, the 9 life revolutions realm. The world of cultivation was complex and intermingled, but it was generally accepted that body realm cultivation ceased to be important after the vessel tempering realm was completed. There was a very simple reason for this. For chi realm cultivation, one would open chi pulses in the pulse opening realm and chi vessels in the divine vessel realm. Then, during the connecting heaven realm, these pulses and vessels would be connected to form the immortal rings of the immortal ring realm. The immortal ring realm was the legendary realm that connected all 3 pillars of cultivation: the body, kai, and the mind connecting the body, chi, and spiritual pulses and vessels. However, there were no other realms past this, where cultivating all 3 could be deemed important. As such, many cultivators usually focused on chi cultivation after completing their immortal rings, while mental realm masters like those of the Zhu clan abandoned body realm cultivation to focus on their mind and kai. So, as one might expect from this reality, the Zhu clan hardly bothered with techniques that continued into the 3rd and 4th realms of body cultivation. From what Ryu could tell, they had less than 10 techniques that even touched upon the 3rd realm and none that touched upon the 4th. Ryu couldn't bring himself to question their methods. After all, wasn't Asuka a sky god? That was the highest cultivation realm in all of existence. If their method was flawed, they obviously wouldn't have produced even one of these lofty individuals, let alone 4 of them. Even Ryu's Tatsuya clan only had one in their history, and that was Ryu's great-grandfather, his grandpa Tatsuya's father. Though Ryu had never met the man, nor did his family ever talk about him. Thinking of his great-grandfather, Ryu could only shake his head. If he had been there, instead of disappearing to who knows where, how could the Tatsuya clan have ever fallen? Wait, Ryu's face lit up with a happy smile. Even if his family was here, they would be shocked. This sort of expression was one Ryu rarely, if ever, showed. His light smiles usually had a piercing coldness to them, but this was filled with absolute warmth. The technique he just came across, it was the very one his mother, Himari, used. When he saw the technique, he felt a wave of warmth wrap around him. He forgot for a moment that he was in enemy territory. Phoenix heavenly body. This technique can only be used by those with phoenix blood. Those without will undoubtedly die. Ryu realized immediately why this technique started with a warning. Chi techniques circulated Kai, but body techniques circulated blood. One was done in the meridians, while the other was accomplished within blood vessels. Judging by the circulation patterns asked for in this book, even Ryu felt a cold shiver go down his spine. If a normal person even attempted this, wouldn't they erupt in a blaze of flames? Still, Ryu felt happy, even though this technique was missing two of its fragments. Ryu had long since opened his body pulses, but he hadn't been able to begin opening his body vessels because his bodily strength wasn't enough to withstand it. What body techniques did was utilize blood circulation to strengthen the body by cultivating what was known as vital chi. Though it was called Kai as well, it was fundamentally different from other energies. It was directly tied to an individual's vitality and could only be accumulated in the blood before being passed on to the rest of the body. With this technique, Ryu would be able to cultivate the first two body realms. As for the final two fragments, that would be left up to fate. For now, it was time to step onto the pedestal plane. For the first time in half a year, Ryu stood. Various popping noises erupted from his body as he stood to his full height of just over 2 meters tall. In the past years, even he hadn't realized until now just how much he had grown. If it wasn't for the fact his garments and skin were an absolute bloody and impurity-filled mess, Ryu would have likely realized that his height wasn't the only change he experienced. But unfortunately, there was no place to take a bath on the immortal plane. Finally, Ryu took a step forward, walking with an air of arrogance and confidence. In that moment, he suddenly stopped and roared at the top of his lungs. He had done it. He had survived. A deep, almost bestial part of him was throbbing. That experience of being forced into a corner and surviving against all odds. He had never felt it before during his sheltered life on the shrine plane. This was it. This was what he had been missing all of his life. Show me what you have in store for me, pedestal plane. You can't lose out to a mortal plane, right? Ryu looked at the portal before him with a fiery battle intent twinkling in his silver eyes. It seemed it was a bit too difficult to ignore the Tatsuya blood that ran through his veins. Valor City. When Ryu appeared on the pedestal plane, he was sent to an area free of danger and most other humans. He believed this to be in thanks to Shrine Mountain once more. From Ryu's understanding, it had a habit of teleporting those who survived its trial to the weakest areas of the plane. This was in order to give those who ascended a chance to adapt, instead of being snuffed out by a power they were in no position to handle. Still, Ryu didn't spend much time in the wilderness. Aside from cleaning himself in a nearby lake and making a pair of leg garments from an unfortunate beast, he directly headed toward one of the most popular centers of power in the Outer Ring. Thanks to Granny Miriam's help, Ryu had a memory jade with a map of a large part of the Outer Ring, though it was mostly empty toward the center. Ryu wasn't worried at all about attracting attention here because his plans for the pedestal plane would thrust him into the spotlight soon enough anyway. Valor City, a territory Ryu was currently approaching the gate of, was one of the 9 major cities of the Outer Ring. It was a center of power which was shared by 3 sects, 3 so-called fifth-order sects. A sect's ranking was decided by the same system as the categorization of beasts, partially. A fifth-order beast was the equivalent of a divine vessel realm expert, but a fifth-order sect, in order to earn this title, must have 10 divine vessel realm experts and at least 1 ancestor of the connecting heaven realm. This logic continues for all rankings. One must have 10 experts, the equivalent of the order they are assigned, plus at least 1 expert a single order above. One can see here just how large the difference between the Outer Ring and the higher mortal plane was. In reality, the sects of the higher mortal plane wouldn't even be considered of the 4th order. They simply didn't have that many spiritual severing realm experts. They'd be considered half-step 4th order sects. Only the former heavenly body sect was a true 4th order sect. That said, considering the difference in quality of expert between the planes, even the heavenly body sect wouldn't be a match for a mere third-order sect found here. Of course, aside from the 3 fifth-order sects that controlled Valor City, there were many more subordinate sects who had a small say as well. Just from this, one could see just how large the outer ring was. It had taken Ryu half a month of his top speed to reach the nearest major city. As Ryu was about to cross the large open gates and into a large city, he was suddenly halted. Halt. Those with identification must identify themselves at the city gates. Those without must register themselves for a fee of 10 silver. Ryu had expected this much. Such a large city would definitely have its own rules and laws. From what he was aware of, the mayor of Valor City was a divine vessel realm expert himself, making his influence equivalent to the elders of the 3 ruling sects. So he had dignity of his own. Just as one guard stepped toward Ryu, another suddenly pulled him back, causing the first to be spun into a cycle of confusion. "What are you doing?" The first guard who spoke to Ryu asked. "Are you a fool? These rules only apply to those below the chi refinement realm. Plus, look at his age, and the fact he's already a higher chi refinement expert. He clearly just came from the wilderness, but has no supplies in hand. But look at the ring on his finger. I'm saving you, yet you dare talk back to me. Apologize and hope that he forgives you." The second guard snarled in a low voice. The first guard became flustered. He had just tried to extort 10 silver from a genius. He had seen Ryu's bare chest and beast skin skirt, and immediately made assumptions. "Ah, young master, please forgive me." As the first guard was about to go into a spiel about how he had a wife and kids to take of, Ryu, who hadn't even paused his steps, had already stepped into the city, eyes closed and hair as blemishless as freshly fallen snow blowing. The first guard sighed a breath of relief. It seemed this young master couldn't be bothered to deal with him. That was good. Definitely good. If others saw how flustered the usually arrogant Valor guards had become at the sight of Ryu, they would have been astonished. The truth of the matter was that the rules of the city were based on age, not just cultivation realm. Ryu didn't even look 19 years old yet his cultivation was so grand. If he had been a middle-aged chi refinement expert, the first guard would have been right to stop him. But to those as lowly as mere gate guards, offending those with potential was the worst sin. Was Ryu really a higher chi refinement expert? Of course not. But before he even completed his first revolution, his Kai was as pure as someone who had completed 2, likely thanks to his ice jade crystal body. Now that he had officially completed 1, plus considering the fact he was stacking the Kai accumulation abilities of 3 6-star chi techniques, his level of Kai purity and quantity made those around him sense a higher chi refinement expert. Sensing the cultivation of an individual wasn't an exact science. It was usually based on intuition and experience, and Ryu was too unconventional for those things to work as they should. Ryu's appearance caught the eyes of many as he walked into the city, but he had no intention of staying on its outskirts. He would head directly into the circle of elites, the very core of Valor City. Ryu strode through the streets, heading toward the circle of elites with a purposeful gait. According to Granny Miriam, the circle of elites was the true hub of every major city. It was the place that had not only the best cultivation resources, but was also a gathering center for the powerful. As a result, it contained the best auction houses, inns, and practically anything else one could think of. Ryu had 2 main purposes. He wanted to accumulate valuable ores and gather spiritual herbs. The herbs would help his cultivation. Unlike Kai stones, consuming spiritual herbs wouldn't have any adverse effects on his foundation. Though the reason others couldn't use this method was due to the fact spiritual herbs were usually more effective after being refined into pills. However, pills almost always had impurities, making them detrimental to consume in large amounts. Only Ryu, who had the incubator, or an individual from a prestigious family willing to wastefully use spiritual herbs, could use this method of cultivation. As for why Ryu wanted ores, that was simpler. He needed weapons, but he needed them to be forged to his specifications. At the moment, he wasn't worthy of a weapon forged with breaking ore. Plus, he doubted that any blacksmiths here had the skill to forge such a weapon. So, Ryu decided to find a few decent pieces of ore to commission a blacksmith to help him. After using common-grade weapons for more than 3 years now, Ryu felt it was time to graduate. In addition, if his next plan was to work out well, he couldn't allow himself to be handicapped by a weak weapon. Regular wooden polearms couldn't handle his strength any longer. It would probably be cheaper to just buy weapons instead of commissioning their creation. But Ryu still hadn't given up on his dual-wielding style. He wanted his weapons to be identical and perfectly balanced for that purpose. For obvious reasons, it was impossible for Ryu to find such a thing unless he commissioned them. This aside, though Ryu didn't care very much for his appearance, he was still aware that entering the circle of elites bare-chested and in beast skins would bring more trouble than it was worth. So, not long after he entered the center of the city, he directly entered what seemed like a well-established clothing store. Maybe under normal circumstances, the attendants would have turned their nose up at him. But since they happened to be women, they were too busy blushing to look down on Ryu. After entering the chi refinement realm and maturing to the stature of a young man from a teenager, Ryu's charm had grown to a new level. It also seemed that he wafted a perpetual intoxicating aroma. Usually it was useful in calming beasts, but it seemed to work on women just as easily. The smell of a nature. Not even half an hour later, Ryu left the store in a set of sleek black robes with 10 more in his spatial ring. It was made of inferior material compared to what he once wore on the shrine plane, but from what he understood, it was quite high class for the pedestal plane. Its major flaw, though, was that it wasn't very good for battles. It would likely immediately rip apart in an intense fight. Just who was that young man? The door attendant put her small hand over her chest. It seemed she had forgotten to breathe. It's such a shame. The heavens always harm the talented. So handsome, yet blind. I hear the inner ring selections are only a few years from now. A gossipy attendant butted in. Many outer ring geniuses are starting martial journeys for the sake of gaining experience and improving. An inner ring selection. Why? Another attendant asked in confusion. They're usually only held once every few decades, but the last one was less than 10 years ago. According to what I've heard, the Ice Devil Legacy world is opening on the Blossom Plains soon. The core region is thinking of fostering our plains geniuses to help. An old woman who acted as a manager of the store snorted. To help, she says. You mean to act as cannon fodder so that those Blossom Plain geniuses can reap the true rewards. They're just herding the youth who should hold the future of our plane up like cattle. Manager, you have to watch your words. The attendants looked around worriedly, hoping none of the customers heard the senile old lady. Talking ill of higher planes like this was tantamount to a death sentence. But it seemed the old woman was at the age where she no longer cared what happened to her. Outside the shop's doors, Ryu heard all of these words thanks to his spiritual sense. Ice Devil. I've never heard of it. It's likely not any worthy legacy world. But this makes the path to a higher plane far easier for me. I guess I should be thankful. One might think that Ryu was being ridiculous. Why did the fact he didn't recognize the name matter? It wasn't like he knew everything under the sun. But the problem was that, though he might not, he was very close to knowing everything about ruins. The obvious rebuttal was that Ryu hadn't been in this world for 9 cycles, 100 million years. That time could easily bring about new information he was unaware of. But the truth of the matter was that length of time wasn't enough for an expert who could make Ryu's heart palpitate to appear. In addition, no one notable from Ryu's time went by the name Ice Devil. Experts took their names very seriously since it was tied to their prestige and faith. One wouldn't change theirs easily. Ryu threw these matters to the back of his mind. The path he had chosen and this newly materialized path would definitely collide. He didn't need to chase the latter too fiercely. Everything would fall into place. Soon, Ryu had oriented himself toward his next destination, Valor Auction House. This location handled two sorts of auctions. The first was a conventional minimum bid and minimum bid increase system that took place as large gatherings, but Ryu want to wait for one to be scheduled. The second form auction displayed the materials for sale for a set period of time, usually anything from a few hours to a few days. Bidders would then walk around the display room and publicly attach their bids to the display items. The highest bidder would have their price displayed alongside the item. If no one beat it, they would claim the item once the auction ended. "Welcome to Valor Auction House. Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" A manager of the auction house approached Ryu as he entered after he immediately picked Ryu out as a valuable customer. It seemed Ryu's investment was worth it. "Take me to your display room and I'll see if you have what I need," Ryu said plainly. "Though, if you have any valuable ores you haven't taken out, you can do so. I would also like to see your selection of heavy longbows. The sturdier, the better." The manager hesitated for a moment but stopped himself from asking something stupid. If he really asked Ryu whether he needed help with his blindness, wouldn't he be asking to die? Unless Ryu brought it up himself, he would be beaten to death before he said something about it first. "Right away, sir." Ryu was directly brought to a display room. It was large and had about a dozen individuals glancing around with the barest levels of interest. The items were kept in glass cases that enveloped pedestals that were a bit over a meter tall. Various leading prices could already be seen attached as well. "How does verification work?" Ryu asked, replying to young master. "Since I'm here, I can verify your bids with my personal stamp. This will save sir from having to deal with a long, convoluted process." Of course, this wasn't how things were normally done. To even be allowed into this room, one needed to prove they had a certain amount of money. In addition, some form of identity or collateral was needed to ensure that individuals didn't write random bids they couldn't account for and screw up the proceedings. That said, these measures became meaningless long ago. No one dared to do such things in a major city these days. You'd be asking for death. The name Valor wasn't just for show either. The mayor of their city definitely wouldn't fall below the top 3 city lords. Ryu nodded. "Is this truly the best display room you have?" "Unfortunately," the manager responded quickly. "The best items are usually left for large and well-publicized auctions. Although I can skirt the rules a bit for sir in this regard, I can't break the rules protecting those items. The only method young master can use to see them is by being granted our highest membership card. In addition, even with this card, the items will be far more expensive than they would otherwise be during a public auction. This is in order to protect our auction house from any losses. So they'll be 3 times more expensive than the best-case scenario price of our yearly auctions." Ryu, of course, understood this. An auction house definitely wouldn't take a loss. As such, if an individual wanted to buy an item set for auction ahead of time, they'd be forced to pay 3 times what the highest estimated price of the auction would be. Luckily, money wasn't something Ryu cared about. He just didn't want to waste any time. As soon as he saw that the method of payment here was actually gold coins, he realized that he had overestimated the pedestal plane a bit too much. At least the outer ring, anyway. "What is the method for earning the highest membership card?" Replying to young master, Valor Auction House is intertwined with many ventures including our blacksmith, alchemist, formation, and ruin master associations. Aside from this, there is also our mercenary guild that might appeal to young master as well. In order to earn the highest membership card, there are a few methods. Either become an Earth-grade master of any of our associations, a 4th-order mercenary of our Valor Guild, or spend a total of 10 million gold coins in total between our intertwined ventures. In addition, young master should also note that this highest-ranking membership card is the only level of membership that is universal for all 9 major cities, meaning lower-ranking cards are useless in other cities not directly under our city's control, but this membership card, the Valor Honor Card, is universal. "Is that so?" Ryu nodded. This was definitely useful to him. "What method do you suggest?" If young master has talent enough to join any of our associations, this will likely be the easiest method, though it is impossible for a youth to meet the earth grade requirement. It is lowered to black grade for those below 25 years of age like young master. The only issue with this method is that assessments do not occur often. They are more infrequent than our auctions. Since young master is in a rush, your best bet is to spend 10 million gold coins. But this is a purposely obscene amount, because City Lord prefers talents over riches. 10 million gold coins is the equivalent revenue of the whole of Valor City in a quarter. Ryu noticed that the manager purposely avoided the topic of the Valor Guild, but that only made him more curious. And what of the Valor Guild? The manager coughed awkwardly, replying to young master, "Please forgive me for my rudeness, but the orders of our mercenary guild are incredibly difficult to climb. As you know, orders correspond to beast grade. In order to earn an order, one must hunt 10 such beasts alone. These hunts must also be monitored by an administrator. So even if young master wasn't so young, an appointment would take even more time to set up than even the other available methods, because an administrator capable of overseeing such a high-level assessment would be incredibly busy. And although the requirements are lowered for your age, as well to the third order, it's not easy to find an individual to administer that level of test either. At the very least, it'll take more time than either the public auction or the association exams. Time. It seemed this was what everything boiled down to. In a test that relied on beasts as a testing measure, Ryu definitely had an advantage. However, he didn't dare to use his ice crystal jade body while being monitored. That would only bring him trouble, though it wasn't as though he needed it to defeat third-order beasts. Ryu also had a sneaking suspicion that the manager was getting at something else. He was likely thinking that the time needed to defeat 10 third-order beasts was large. After all, beasts were always more powerful than their human counterparts on average. He probably believed that Ryu would be injured and need to account for time to recover. If Ryu was certain that he could find an administrator today, he was also certain he'd be able to complete the assessment today as well. Unlike the thoughts of the manager, he knew his current strength enough to know that it would be a simple matter. Unfortunately, it seemed like that wasn't in the cards. I see. Ryu nodded. In that case, I'll be going to the Alchemy Association. I assume they have an herbology department which deals in selling spiritual herbs. At first, the manager was caught off guard by the question, but in the next instant, he understood. Instead of wasting gold on useless auction items here, Ryu planned on spending the 10 million necessary gold on spiritual herbs. Wait, that wasn't the most shocking part. This youth actually had 10 million gold to spend. Even Valor City only made 40 to 50 million gold a year. Would even the city lord spend so much in a single sitting? The manager could only awkwardly laugh and bow as he saw Ryu out. Power Stone's Ryu didn't waste any time. His footsteps seemed slow and deliberate, but if one looked closely, it was as though the wind glided him forward several meters with every step. Those in the circle of elites were either wealthy individuals or strong cultivators, usually both. As a result, the depth of Ryu was something that intrigued many and caught their interest. Soon, Ryu made it to the Alchemy Association. As expected, as any proper alchemy association should, they had their own herbology department. Though Ryu never dabbled in alchemy, the depth of his knowledge of herbology was far beyond what those here could contend with, so he planned on taking advantage of this fact. Unfortunately, it seemed Valor City was set on forcing him to waste time. As an unknown customer, he could freely buy common-grade herbs, but should he want to buy spiritual herbs of a higher grade, he had many hoops to jump through. Though Ryu's facial expressions didn't change as he listened to the explanation of the receptionist, he would be lying if he said he wasn't annoyed. It seemed everything in Valor City revolved around one's status, and they seemed to look down on those who wanted to throw money at every problem. If Ryu wanted to spend 10 million gold on common-grade herbs, he'd be out of luck. Deals revolving around common-grade herbs were usually handled with silver, which were worth 1/100th of a gold coin. Even if he was willing to spend 10 million gold, he wouldn't reach that amount even if he bought the association's entire stock. To make matters worse, even if the association had that many common-grade herbs to sell, they would never allow Ryu to clean them out with one purchase because it would imbalance the economy too much, not to mention inconvenience others. Unfortunately, young master, the only way to skirt these rules is by having a Valor honor card or becoming an Earth grade alchemist of our association, or Black grade, considering your age. Or, young master can become a disciple of one of Valor City's sects. The use of sect contribution points have no such rules attached to them, though you have to use universal contribution points which are worth much more than sect-specific contribution points. Finally, a new piece of information: universal contribution points were worth 1,000 times that of sect-specific ones. One would have to join a sect and earn 1,000 points before trading them in for one that could be used anywhere within Valor City territory, including the other two sects. Ryu realized just how important status was here. The pedestal plane must be aware that there were individuals overflowing with gold on the mortal planes. No matter where you were, gold was a universal mineral recognized by all. So, how could the arrogant immortals allow mere mortals to flaunt their wealth as they pleased? This method was a way of dividing those who had true strength from those who didn't. It's a good thing that I had planned on joining a sect anyway. HM. Once Ryu understood the fundamental rules of the pedestal plane, he wasn't discouraged. If anything, he was excited. He'd force the faith of the outer ring to revolve around himself and play them in the palm of his hands. The day he left this place would be the day the name Ryu Tatsuya was immortalized. Thank you for the information, Ryu said faintly. As a normal individual, what are my purchase limits? Replying to young master, you can freely buy common-grade herbs, but you're limited to 3 stocks per herb type. There are no price limits, just quantity caps. Here is what we have available in our inventory currently. The receptionist handed Ryu one of the many memory jade copies they kept on hand for moments like these. Ryu nodded, taking the white memory jade in his hand. Wait a moment. Ryu suddenly paused. You said that if I become a Black grade alchemist, I can buy freely from your association, correct? Do you all not have graded herbologists? The receptionist was shocked by the question. It wasn't that Ryu had said something ridiculous, or maybe it was that. The reason the receptionist hadn't brought this up was because it was more likely for a youth below 20 to become an Earth-grade alchemist than even a common-grade herbologist. This was how exaggerated the differences were. An alchemy disciple took a cultivation technique handed down to them by their master and followed strict procedures to reproduce a long-since vetted method. However, herbologists had no such structure to their system. Knowing the names and properties of spiritual herbs was only just one small aspect. It was necessary to understand how to grow and foster growth in herbs, how different environments affected these herbs, what sorts of mutations could happen or be caused to happen, the chemical structure of these herbs, what changes could occur when splicing or separating these structures. The list was so long that even an entire day wasn't enough to list them all. The best herbologist they had in Valor City was an old monster who was a half-step heaven-grade alchemist. She would garner respect even in the inner ring, yet even she was only a higher Black-grade herbologist. Comparing herbology and alchemy was like comparing doctors to medical pioneers. Of course, doctors had a difficult job, but much of their task was executing concepts and methods already tested and vetted by those who pioneered new fields of their own. One was clearly much more difficult than the other. Let me guess, Ryu said with an almost resigned sigh. It takes several months, maybe years, to set up an appropriately difficult exam and administrator of said exam. The receptionist blinked before grasping her bearings once more. And no, actually, the exam for herbology is standardized across the pedestal plane. It's an exam that takes place in a small realm, and is automatically marked and graded as it happens. Theoretically, if an individual can pay, they can take it immediately and as many times as they want or can afford. Ryu was pleasantly surprised by this response. "Is that so? I'd like to take it then. This." The receptionist stuttered, "Is there a problem?" "And no. It's just that it's very expensive." "How much gold?" Ryu raised an eyebrow. Not gold, but chi stones. One common grade exam costs 10 inferior chi stones. A black grade exam it's 10 medial chi stones. The receptionist seemed to duck away, afraid of Ryu's reaction. "Oh." Ryu mumbled. "That's all. Please bring me to where I must go," Ryu said with a slight hint of impatience in his voice. "I would like to get this over with as quickly as possible." "Ah." The receptionist snapped awake at Ryu's words. Yes, please come with me." The receptionist of the Alchemy Association was actually just one of many. The entrance to the tall tower led into a lobby area, where a large circular desk was placed. As much as a dozen receptionists took up positions within the open center of this circular desk to efficiently help as many customers as possible. As a result, the exchange between Ryu and the receptionist he was charged to wasn't exactly covert. However, was Ryu the type of individual to care for stares and ridicule? He wouldn't give these individuals the time of day, especially considering how their expressions changed when they saw how easily he was willing to spend chi stones. Only core disciples of the major sects would receive 1 inferior chi stone per month, while each sect wouldn't accept more than 10 core disciples in total. Inheritors above them were the only exception. Even elders wouldn't spend so many chi stones at once on such a foolish endeavor. And if what they heard was correct, Ryu would have to become a black-grade herbologist for any of this to matter at all. Even the ancestor of the major sects wouldn't have 10 medial chi stones to spend so willfully. Ryu silently followed the receptionist as they made their way to the higher levels. It seemed that the exams usually took place on this first floor in a back room. However, the herbology exam was a bit special since it required entry into a small realm. As a result, it was located on the same floor as the association head's office, the second floor from the very top. Just as they were about to branch out from the staircase and enter the second highest floor, the receptionist stopped Ryu. "I'm sorry, young master, but I must confirm if you have the funds to proceed. This floor is a very sensitive area that not just anyone can enter. Please excuse my rudeness." Ryu didn't mind it. He simply took out a medial chi stone. The chi stone shimmered like a transparent crystalline gem, storing a fog of white energy. The receptionist immediately understood its level as her breath shortened involuntarily. It was only after she recollected herself that she finally went through what seemed like a complicated procedure to enter, allowing Ryu to follow in after her. It was only after Ryu did that he realized this wasn't much of a floor at all. The door led directly into an office, just as large as the lobby area below. The office was decorated with endless rows of untidy bookshelves. Loose papers and unswept dust were a common sight, but the desk toward its far edge that seemed to hide a figure behind more piles of books made them look organized. "Association head, I've brought an individual who would like to take the herbology exam." Unlike what Ryu expected, the head wasn't a woman. This meant that the so-called best alchemist of their association didn't act as their head, and probably meant that the highest floor they hadn't gone to was reserved for her. A middle-aged man on the slightly older side looked up to see Ryu. He frowned not just at Ryu's age, but the fact that Ryu was blind. The association head had looked up before the receptionist even spoke, because he felt a spiritual sense land on him. It wasn't invasive, but he still didn't like the feeling. Anyone who had been in the martial world for any period of time knew the level of rudeness attached to such a thing. But it seemed that Ryu had his own reasons for using this method, considering his blindness. "Mali, you can't just bring anyone who says they'd like to take the exam to my office." The receptionist, or Mali, seemed flustered by this response. She had expected it, but what could she have done about it? Ryu didn't look like a patient individual. She didn't want to know what would happen if these two strong-willed men clashed. Are there rules to taking this exam aside from the monetary compensation? Ryu turned toward Ma Li. Ma Li was directly put in an awkward position. If she said yes, she'd be slapping her own face and that of Ryu's. After all, it was her job to keep Ryu informed. However, if she said no, she'd be exposing the association head as Patty and slapping his face. How the hell was she supposed to answer this question? Luckily, she didn't have to. The association head sneered. What an arrogant little boy. Ryu frowned. What part of what he had said was arrogant? He asked a simple question. If this old man took offense to that, it said more about him than Ryu. However, Ryu put down his normally quippy response. Though he was a shrine plain prince, it was unintelligent to act as such here. Not to mention the fact this association head was a divine vessel realm expert. Angering him would only waste Ryu's time further and likely make his future harder. I apologize if I've been rude, esteemed association head. This young one would only like a chance. If I fail, then so be it. The association head found it hard to continue to be Patty after Ryu lowered his head. However, what he didn't see was the coldness hidden behind Ryu's eyelids. He assumed that a draft had come through when Ma Li opened the door. But what he didn't know was that he had forever lost the right to Ryu's favor. Ryu's pride was dug deep into his bones, let alone this head before him. Even the world's sea cultivators who could wipe all life from the pedestal plane hadn't made his heart palpitate. He lowered his head for one reason and one reason only: his family. The more time he wasted, the more time he would need to save them. He refused to allow anything to get in the way of that, even if it was his own arrogance. The association head snorted. Do whatever you'd like. The teleportation formation to the small realm was located within the association head's office. It was the only relatively clean spot in the entire place, and was placed upon an elevated silver platform. Ryu didn't waste any more time on nonsense. He handed the chi stones to Ma Li, who used 5 of them to activate the formation and stored the remaining 5. When Ryu reappeared, he was greeted by surroundings that he would have never expected. He stood upon a tall pillar that only had enough space for him to step once in all directions. Below was an endless abyss of darkness that wouldn't hesitate to take his life. But what was truly intriguing was the fact his pillar wasn't the only one. All around him, formed into a large circle, dozens of other pillars had exam takers of their own.